Aloha Friday. Mabuhay. Welcome to everyone. Thank you all again for coming. For the ones that have joined us last week, welcome back. We really appreciate you coming back and joining us again. And so again, welcome to Pamana ng Lahi online teacher training seminar for Philippine language, culture, and literature at this point, brought to you by the University of Hawaii Center for Southeast Asian Studies in partnership with the Mindanao State University General Santos, Departamento ng Filipino, and the Filipino Language and Culture Program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And my name again is Markee Micu. I am one of your hosts today. And joining me here is our mother in the Filipino department, Tita Pia.
Magandang hapon po, aloha, maalam na babati po sa ating lahat. We are so happy that you can make it to today's webinar. Welcome to all our guests and special greetings to Miss Helen Grace Quisha from the Consulate of Guam. Talagang pang-international ang ating mga participants ngayon, Markee.
Yes, nga, Tita. Like we have participants from all over the world, so this is really exciting. And it looks like there are still a lot of people joining us. People are trickling in. But let's get started. So let's get going with this one. And for everyone who would want to post about our event on your social media, don't forget to use our official hashtag Pamana ng Lahi. That's PAMANANG LAHI, Pamana ng Lahi. Or you could also use Pamana ng Lahi 2026 for this year. We've been doing this since, I believe, 2021. Tama ba, Tita? There have been like previous versions.
I think so. Yes.
2021, and we've been doing it. Go ahead and you can put the year when you joined in. So for this year. So this webinar will also be recorded and it will be made available on our website. Our website will be up and live soon. I believe we'll put it on our chat later on. We've launched it already, but we'll have an official launch at some point. But this is our new website that we are using for Pamana ng Lahi. So be in the lookout for that one. Other resources, including modules and recordings from previous Pamana ng Lahi events, are also available in the website. And so before we officially get started, again, just a quick disclaimer, the same as last week. Just a reminder that the views and opinions expressed by the host speakers do not state or reflect those of the organizers, the University of Hawaii, the Mindanao State University General Santos, and the Filipino and Philippine Culture Program, and of course, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Tita Pia?
This webinar will have two segments, one on the teaching of language and the other on literature and creative writing. Join us for an engaging teacher training workshop featuring experienced Filipino language and culture educators from Hawaii, Japan, the Philippines, and the continental United States. Participants will gain insights on Filipino as a heritage and language, explore teaching methods, gain a unique cross-cultural perspective along with practical tools, valuable resources, and effective strategies for creating a dynamic classroom environment and impacts. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to, of course, introduce my co-host. Maraming salamat, Markee Micu, who is co-founder of Baliktanaw, a student-led virtual conference focused on issues faced by Filipino diaspora. After earning his BA in Biology and Philippine Language and Culture, he relocated to San Francisco. Markee now works on skin cancer research and innovative health tech devices. I'm so glad I could get to steal him for our events.
Yes, naman, Tita. Anytime. I'll be joining you. Of course, I'm one of the OGs that started Pamana, so I will always be here. But anyway,
Maraming salamat.
of course, Tita, you're welcome. We are bringing you an exciting lineup of distinguished speakers. Last week, we had speakers from pretty much a lot of it in Hawaii, and then some of them are here in the continental US. Today we have speakers from I believe some are in Asia, some are in the East Coast, some's also in the West Coast. So we are bringing you speakers from all over the world this time. Okay, so before we begin, again, we would like to recognize the people who made this event possible. This lecture series is brought to you by the University of Hawaii Center for Southeast Asian Studies in partnership with the Mindanao State University General Santos, Departamento ng Filipino, and the Filipino Language and Culture Program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa.
We thank the MSU team, Department Chair Rosel Simon, Dr. Debbie Cruspero, Director of the Center ng Wika at Kultura, Dr. Ian Jaisel, Graduate School Coordinator for MA Filipino, Ms. Herinawati Abdul Syukur, Focal for Internationalization, Ms. Angeles Ismael, and Ms. Marichu Falsario. And my special thanks to Mr. Wilmar Cabajo for his close coordination with the Pamana ng Lahi team.
All right, so just a quick housekeeping reminder here. We definitely encourage everyone to engage with us on the chat and use the Zoom. We don't have a Q&A question portion on our Zoom right now. We don't have that Q&A feature, but you can go ahead and type your questions on the chat. After maybe some of our speakers have spoken, they can answer it. But just a quick rundown, we'll have our first three speakers, and then after that, we'll have about a 15 to 20 minute open forum where you could ask your questions. You could unmute yourself and ask your questions, or just keep typing on the chat. But then again, if you do have any questions that pop up while the speakers are presenting their presentations, you can go ahead and put that in the chat, and maybe at some point one of our speakers could answer your questions, or we can do that during the open forum as mentioned. All right, so let's get going. Let's get started. Simulan na natin to. All right, so our first speaker is a lecturer in Philippine Language Studies at Yale University and member of the Council on Southeast Asian Studies. He holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he also earned a graduate certificate in multilingual, multicultural professional practice. His research centers on the description, documentation, acquisition, and revitalization of Austronesian languages and writing systems, with a particular focus on endangered and heritage language contexts. His contribution to Philippine language studies have been recognized with honors including the 2024 Excellence in Research Award from UH Manoa and the inaugural Sharing Language Diversity Fellowship from the Endangered Language Fund. So, Tita Pia?
Before the program in Yale, he also started the Filipino program at the University of Victoria, Canada. We are always grateful that he used to work and he brought prestige to the Filipino program by joining its faculty a while back. Please welcome Dr. Louward Zubiri.
Thank you, Markee and Tita Pia, for that warm introduction. And thank you again for the Filipino program at UH Manoa and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for inviting me to the Pamana workshop. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so today I'll talk about the intermediate puzzle, balancing grammar and functional communication in Heritage Filipino. So I'll start, as usual, by sharing my positionality and some preliminaries. I'll talk a bit about the intermediate proficiency, and then discuss what the intermediate puzzle is all about, and then I'll describe some non-basal structures, and then I'll end with some parting words. So to begin, just, a quick intro. Filipino is one of the official languages of the Philippines, and it's also its national language. Linguistically, Filipino is based on the grammar and structure of Tagalog. And in the North American context, Filipino is a less commonly taught language, despite being among the most widely spoken home languages in the US. So it's actually the fourth language spoken at home other than English. Also, in the North American context, learners of Filipino can be heritage language learners, or HLLs, or second language learners. So as a result of this, Students may students may enter the Filipino classes with varying degrees of prior exposure to the language, including ethnically Filipino learners who may have had little to no experience with the language before formally taking Filipino. So the full Filipino program offers 4 levels of instruction from level 1 to level 4. They operationalize it basically as year 1 Filipino, year 2 Filipino, year 3 Filipino, and year 4 Filipino. And I've put here the alignment with the target proficiency from novice low up to advanced. So the thing is with this um, characterization of a full Filipino program, it is actually only UH Manoa who has a full Filipino program based on this categorization. So other programs only typically offer up to intermediate. Some programs like Harvard and Yale offer advanced class. But then if you um, decouple some of the classes, so year 1 would be first semester, second semester Filipino, up to year 4, which would be 7th semester and 8th semester Filipino. A lot of the programs in the United States only offer until 4th semester Filipino or 5th semester Filipino. So it's actually very rare to find a Filipino program in North America to have all 4 years. And that's why earlier the question on how you curricularly program a Filipino program is a big question, especially when you think about the student's progression, the learner's progression. So because my talk focuses on the intermediate level, let's just revisit what do we mean by intermediate. And one of the main characterization of intermediate proficiency is based on a proficiency scale. There's a lot of proficiency scales out there. I'll just cite ACTFL because it's typically used within North America. And here you see the typical figure of the inverted pyramid, illustrating the different proficiency levels from novice low up to superior. So let's just look at some of these levels and how do we describe each of the levels. So for novice, so someone with novice proficiency can engage in conversations and produce written text on familiar topics. And the things they use have been extensively researched, meaning it's formalized language that has been learned and rehearsed. And these are very predictable oral or written messages. And then it's usually accompanied by visual or contextual support. So what's the difference of intermediate from novice? So for intermediate proficiency, you still have the familiar, but it expands to everyday topics and you have connected discourse. And one of the hallmarks of intermediate proficiency is spontaneous situation, spontaneous production of speech, as opposed to rehearsed and repeated utterances or repeated or rehearsed speech. So here you have sentence language, and then typically contextual support is limited, especially in contrast with novice proficiency. So here, the context of the intermediate is always the personal, something that's very familiar to you or the speaker, and the everyday, their daily life, the things around them. And the output of an intermediate proficiency is free production, the ability to be able to produce sentences level discourse of your own volition. It means you're not necessarily prompted to repeat a sentence. You can produce a sentence level utterance of your own. And those sentences show some level of slowly connectedness. So what's the puzzle? So the puzzle is within the objectives of an intermediate level course or an intermediate level proficiency setup or class, you want to be able to participate in simple conversations. You want to be able to ask and answer questions. You want to be able to describe your daily activities, routines, preferences, and experiences. And you want to manage practical, familiar situations. But then, let's look at some of the examples. So if you have a question like this, ano-ano ang mga ginagawa mo bago ka pumasok sa paaralan, what are the things you do before you go to school, which is a typical prompt at the intermediate level. So how does a learner answer this particular prompt? Let's look at this typology of responses. So ito yung mga sagot nila. I shower, I make ligo, naliligo ako, nagsha-shower ako. So one cluster of responses. And then let's look at another cluster of responses. Mahilig ako mag-gym bago pumasok sa school. Nagpapagising ako ng maaga sa aking nanay, pinaghahanda ako ng almusal ng aming helper, nagda-drive ako papunta sa school, so another cluster, and then let's look at the last cluster. Sinusubukan mong tapusin ng mga homework ko bago ako pumasok sa school. So if we look at this extensive list of potential answers, which ones do you consider to be an intermediate level response? So anong uri ng sagot ang nag-highlight na sila ay intermediate level? So that's one of the core questions that we usually think about, especially in terms of curricular programming and then assessment of like what is an intermediate level. So let's expand this a bit by showing more probable answers. Ano-ano ang ginagawa mo bago ka pumasok sa paaralan? Bago school, kinain ako rice at adobo. Is this intermediate? Ano-ano ang mga ginagawa mo bago ka pumasok sa paaralan? Wala. Is this also intermediate? Ano-ano ang mga ginagawa mo bago ka pumasok sa paaralan? Bago pumasok sa school, ako ay pumupunta sa gym para mag-ehersisyo araw-araw. Is this intermediate? Ano-ano ang mga ginagawa mo bago ka pumasok sa paaralan? Ako punta gym para exercise. Is this intermediate? So the puzzle then becomes, as we see, learners make errors. That's true, and that's part of language development. That's part of learning. You make mistakes because you are still in the process of learning. It's okay to make errors while you are learning. However, these types of errors should stem from forms and patterns that are not yet cognitively entrenched, meaning patterns are not yet internalized in your cognitive schema. So this error shouldn't come from the lack of grammatical instruction, the lack of overt pattern instruction. So let's look at some other examples. So in language classes, we always put forward like the primacy of the authentic source. It should come from an example that's out there in the real world, as if the classroom is not part of the real world. So let's look at this. So this is a news report from one of the newspapers in the Philippines. If you see, the theme is beyond the familiar. It's beyond everyday. I mean, well, it depends on what you how you define everyday, but typically you would see that the theme is atypical for intermediate because it's not personal and it's not part of your daily life. But this is an example of an authentic source used at the intermediate level. But beyond the theme, let us look at the structure. So these are two sentences from that authentic source. We have nagkabatuhan sa magkabilang panig at maya-maya pa, narinig ang sunod-sunod na mga putok ng baril. And then ipinakita ng mga residente sa Pinoy Weekly ang mga basyo ng M16 na na-recover sa lugar. So ito ay dalawang, and these are two sentences that's from that authentic source. Are these sentences intermediate? Are these sentences comprehensible to an intermediate learner? So that's when we go to what I call the non-basal structures. So non-basal structures basically are structures which in linguistics, these are patterns that are understood to be derived from other simpler underlying structures. So it's derived from something simpler, something more simple. These patterns are considered non-basal, so they're not the baseline of language, because these sentences can always be reformulated in a much simpler form, in a much simpler pattern. And those simpler patterns within the framework of language development and language learning are easier to learn because they have less cognitive load, they have less semantic load. They're easier to understand because they're simpler. So let's look at some of the typical non-basal structures at the intermediate level. So the first one is I inversion. So I inversion is the presence of the particle I, and it's called the I inversion because typically it alludes to the change of word order in a Filipino sentence. So let's look at these examples. Ang pangalan ko ay Louward. Louward ang pangalan ko. So two sentences that have the same meaning but different word order, and the difference of word order is because of the introduction of the particle I. Um, and then to anyone who went through Basic Ed Filipino, this difference in pattern is very familiar to us. This is the karaniwang ayos at ang di karaniwang ayos, right? So, and then from Basic Ed Filipino, you already have an inkling. There's an hint that these two are related because these two are variant patterns of the same thing. But then one pattern is more marked and the other is more unmarked. Basically, one pattern is more typical, it's more common, and the other pattern is less common or less typical. And then you see that from the name itself, karaniwang ayos, typical order, typical sequence, a typical form. Di karaniwan, atypical or uncommon, right? And then I can go on with the grammaticality of why this is unmarked or marked. But the point here is that these two types of sentences can be used by learners to express themselves, typically in a self-introduction task or a self-introduction exercise. But then the question then becomes, what type of sentence do you expect a learner of intermediate level to produce? What type of sentence does a learner at the novice level produce? So those are some of the questions. And then furthermore, we see that the karaniwang ayos, the typical format, the typical pattern, is cognitively more basal. And it's because it follows a basic schematic pattern, a basic schema, a basic order that is found across the structures of most basal sentences in Filipino, which I'll just show. So, Louward ang pangalan ko, ito ang pangalan ko, unique ang pangalan ko, ibinigay sa akin ng mga magulang ko ang pangalan ko. So, these are different types of sentences using different types of words. So, different word classes. Louward ang pangalan ko. Louward is a personal name. It's a noun. And that's a noun in that first slot. Ito ang pangalan ko. Ito is a pronoun substitute for nouns, and ito is also in the first slot. Unique is an adjective. It's a name that's used to, it's a label used to define or characterize a property of a certain other word. And then ibinigay is a verb that takes up the role of predication in this sentence. So you see here that the first slot typically in basal structures of Filipino is the predicate. And the predicate in Filipino, as opposed to other languages that we know, like English, can be of different word class. It can be a noun, it can be an adjective, it can be a verb, but in basal structure, that is the first slot. And then you have your privileged entity, you have your highlighted entity, the most important entity in the sentence, which is, in this case, marked by ang, because pangalan is a common noun. So we see here that even though there's a pedagogical explanation of di karaniwang ayos and karaniwang ayos, that pedagogical explanation is based on linguistic structure, and it's also based on schematic formation. It's based on a basal schema, predication first, followed by the most important entity in the sentence. So let's look at another type of pattern that we encounter at the intermediate level. So ability forms. So expressing actions you can do or you cannot do if it's the negative. So here you have the first sentence, kaya kong kumain ng maanghang na pagkain, which is more basal than nakakakain ako ng maanghang na pagkain. So literally, I'm able to eat spicy food. I can eat spicy food. And you see that the nakakakain is derived from something more basic because it requires more things than a typical particle. In this case, the modal kaya, could or can. So these are some of the patterns that at the intermediate level you encounter, grammar patterns at the intermediate level you encounter, but do we have scaffolding of this in our authentic materials, in our authentic sources, or even at the elementary level, at the novice level? And the challenge there is, at the intermediate, we have something called the intermediate plateau. So the plateau effect basically is a temporary cessation when learners move from intermediate to advanced. So basically, at the intermediate level, especially once they reach peak intermediate or intermediate high, learners experience difficulties making noticeable progress to advance. And this plateau is magnified when there is less overt attention given to some of the patterns that we see earlier, because there is also a related effect to this called fossilization. When errors becomes normalized, they are not errors anymore. They're part of how you use language because it's normalized. And then because it's normalized, it's cognitively entrenched, it's internalized. So that's another issue of, again, the intermediate. So if we revisit the question, the conundrum then is how to balance functional complexity, and we see here in the intermediate context, the differences in intermediate tasks, with the grammatical complexity that accompanies Filipino at the higher level and Filipino heritage instruction. So this raises more questions. What should intermediate proficiency in Filipino actually entail? And we have explored that by looking at some of the responses to the prompt and whether those responses are actually intermediate or not. So my suggested solution to this is to go back and apply backward design. So backward design is when you don't treat each of the levels as isolated stages. You don't treat novice as separate from intermediate. You don't treat intermediate as separate from advanced. You don't treat advanced separate from superior. So these are all connected proficiency levels. And because they're connected, even the grammatical patterns are all connected. It's not just about the task you can do. It's also about what you can say and how you can say the things you can do. So instruction begins with the communicative and linguistic demands of a higher proficiency, typically advanced, and you work backward to identify the skills, the grammatical features, and the task type that should be systematically developed from the lower levels, from intermediate and then from novice or elementary. Okay, and I'll end with that. So for my parting words, the intermediate puzzle in Heritage Filipino is not simply a question of how much grammar a learner know or how well they can communicate or how well they know grammar. Rather, it's about how we meaningfully integrate grammatical development with functional communication within the realities of heritage language learning. So language input, whether it's from an authentic material, authentic source, or elsewhere, only becomes valuable when it is transformed into intake. So intake are input that learners can process, that learners can internalize, and that learners can use meaningfully. Anything that's not intake is not taken by the learners for their learning. So from there, structured and measured output then helps improve automaticity. So you try to imbibe international entrenchment. It becomes more internal, it becomes more intrinsic through practice and through repeated use. So if intermediate proficiency is the bridge to higher proficiency, then our curricula must move beyond just survival communication, beyond just saying the answer to whatever question or responding to a specific task. It should be toward intentional linguistic scaffolding because this is a program. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. And then ultimately, the goal again is not grammatical perfection. It is the development of multilingual speakers who can meaningfully and effectively use Filipino. And I'll end with that. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
Maraming salamat, Kuya Louward. And again, how we do this in UH, especially in the Filipino department, we do isang bagsak. The ones that joined us last week know how to do this. But when we say isang bagsak, just do one big clap right after I say isang bagsak. Let's do one practice first. Isang bagsak. All right, let's do it one more time. Isang bagsak. All right, maraming salamat again, Kuya Louward, for sharing the challenges and the realities faced by both the learners and you as the instructors for intermediate level proficiency, heritage language learners, and of course for sharing what can be done to them and how to address these challenges. Thank you again for sharing your expertise and that. All right, so moving on, I think we lost Tita Pia for a little quick minute here. She will be back shortly, but let me go ahead and introduce nope, she is back.
Aloha. Thank you so very much, Markee. Our next presenter is, sorry, give me a second, is Senior Filipino Language Teacher at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. She received a BA in Linguistics from the University of the Philippines and an MA in Japanese Language Education at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo, Japan. She taught Japanese in UP and helped develop Japanese language materials and programs for high school students and teachers under the Japan Foundation, Manila. She also has experience in teaching Filipino, English, and Cebuano to Japanese people living in the Philippines. Mga kaibigan, let us give a round of applause for Miss Flori Palma Hill for this very exciting lecture on virtual reality.
Thank you, Tita Pia. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. First of all, I would like to say I'll be shifting to different screens, so please bear with me. So let me share my slides now. Sorry. Can you see my slides now? I can't see everyone.
Yes.
Sige. Sige, magandang umaga at magandang hapon or gabi sa inyong lahat. Thank you to the organizers of Pamana ng Lahi for having me here. I hope I can share some inspiration to everyone who has chosen Filipino as their career or would-be career. I will be sharing a research paper I wrote with the teachers of University of the Philippines Open University, Professor Roberto Figueroa Jr., Mr. Hiroshi Taniguchi, and Mr. Jose Rica Esguerra. So basically, they're the ones who created the virtual reality tours, so photo-based tours. So the experiments we did in this paper were done in my first year class. And for first year classes. That's why I will also be sharing how I conducted the classes, which I hope I can share in an interesting way to teach basic Filipino grammar to your students. First, let me introduce a short background of the Filipino language education in Japan. This is the map showing where Filipino language classes are being offered. So only one offer Filipino at the primary level, and several high schools offer them, but most of the classes are offered as electives at the university level. However, at the University of Osaka and my university, Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Filipino subjects are offered as major subjects. So under the Philippine Studies program. So in my university, Filipino is among the 28 major languages being offered. And but unlike most of the students in the US, the students here are mostly Japanese. Well, from time to time, there are some Japanese students of Filipino descent whose mother or father is a Filipino. So at least like once a year, one in one class. So here is our curriculum. Grammar classes are only offered during the first and second year levels. What I mean by this is, mainly you have a class where grammar is explained. And then we have conversation classes are for the first year to third year students. Then in the higher levels, we have focus classes on reading and writing for third year and fourth year students. And here are the number of students majoring in the Filipino language. So happily, the number of students are increasing each year. And here is a list of our activities for the whole year, the university's activities for the whole year. So during the spring vacation, which is February to March, as well as during the summer vacation, August to September, students have a chance to go to the country of the language they are learning. So what do they do there? They usually take more advanced classes or do some, for our students, they do some volunteer works, helping build roads in schools in the rural areas, and or they do internship at Japanese companies that offer services to Filipinos. So during this time, the students have opportunities to experience the Philippines firsthand, and they apply Filipino expressions they learned inside the classroom. And this increases the students' motivation to learn and love the Filipino language and culture. But the experiment actually happened during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we know that the classes changed to online classes and trips abroad were suspended. So students who were studying minor languages like Filipino, they were all disheartened and frustrated, questioning their language choice. And for many, the circumstance they were put in, since a lot of our students did not really choose Filipino as their first language of choice to study. It so happens that during that time, during the pandemic, my friend Rob, who is now the Dean of Faculty of Information and Communication Studies at the UP Open University, he was still finishing his PhD and was looking for a class to try out his experiment on presence and satisfaction in education technology. So to make the long story short, he created 6 virtual reality tours, photo-based tours, showcasing some places in the Philippines using the list of vocabulary I gave him. So we have been doing this virtual tours since 2020. But from 2020, so 2020, 2021, full online classes, and our students, usually just around 15, were divided into 3 groups. So high immersion groups, which means that they, I don't know if you can see them, because I can see you, they use VR goggles like this attached to their phones. So these are the high immersion groups. Then moderate immersion groups, they did not use VR goggles, but used the virtual tours. And then the lower immersion group, which only use the photo-based PowerPoint tours. So before we use PowerPoint tours, now we have them on Canva. But yeah, from 2022, so it's back to face-to-face, but yeah, it was transition. So online and face-to-face, but now it's all face-to-face, but we still do these tours. But right now we just divide the class into 2 groups, the high immersion and the low immersion. So it's something like this. So the groupings, since 2022, all students can experience both VR goggles, and the slide tours. So they exchange. First they do half of the class, they do the goggles, and then they exchange and they try the tours. The Canva tours. So basically, we do this around this time, and we have 6 tours. So 4 tours are in both Japanese and Filipino, and only the target vocabulary are in Filipino. So the tour is mostly in Japanese. And while the 2 tours are only in Filipino. So during our experiment and until now, I still follow this procedural diagram. So, but due to the time constraints, I will not be able to show you the pre-test, post-test. Maybe if we have time after my presentation, I might be able to show you. And I will show you the sample lesson later. So these are the list of words we included in the tours based on the textbook we are using. So for our and speaking of the research for our study, we collected students' answers from surveys and focus group discussions. Then we combined them with our observation notes. So we did this study twice in 2020 and in 2022. And let me share you some of our results. So this one shows that there was a statistically significant strong correlation between presence and satisfaction ratings in all the tours. So this means that a lot of students who felt as if they were inside a train or inside a church showed higher satisfaction towards the tours. So I think it was the using the goggles. So we analyzed the data using quantitative and qualitative analysis. So that was part of the quantitative. Now this is qualitative part. So we found 4 benefits of the tour according to the focus group discussion and of our observation notes. So one is increased engagement. So a student said, I could feel the Philippines with a VR tour, even if I'm not there. Then we have perceived vocabulary retention. So we can see the real Philippines, and with the actual situation, I can learn the vocabulary. Plus, they said it was the tour was repeated many times, so they can remember, they're able to remember the vocabulary. Then interest. So according to the survey, students with initially slightly negative view of the country changed the impression of it, and the tours made them want to visit the Philippines. And finally, authentic information about the Philippines. So half of the participants mentioned that they were happy to be able to learn about the history of the Philippines or see everyday life in the Philippines, like the fashion, etc. And of course, we also found challenges like computer or phone trouble or the obscureness of the photos. They said they were not clear. And the Filipino only tours were still very difficult for their level. So here are my references. Now let me share with you a sample lesson using the VR and slide course. But first, let me show you the tours, some of the tours. Mm. So, um, so this is the first tour, Rizal Park. So using, like I said, the goggles, they can walk around or just stand up and um, look through their goggles. And then listen to the tours. Okay, so AU in Japanese is bayani. And then they learn the other words by clicking these audio icons. Let me show you another one. So this is LRT. I think you know this if you are in the Philippines or if you have been in the Philippines. So they can experience how it's really packed inside. Okay. So Eki is session. Before sorry, I have to change again. I want to show you the PowerPoint tours. So they're really very simple. It's just a PowerPoint with audio. Continue to share. Yes. So it's like this.
Sorry, Flori, could you reshare sound? They can't hear
Sorry.
the audio. Maybe get out muna of the PowerPoint and share
Oh,
sound, please. Thanks.
sorry. So you didn't hear the sound earlier too. Sorry. Which one? This one.
Naka-t-shirt des.
So let me repeat that.
さっきからずっと待ってるみたいだけど、この T シャツを着た人は誰かと待ち合わせかな。ボビーさん、T シャツを着ていますはフィリピン語で何ですか？
Naka-t-shirt des. Naka-t-shirt.
どの人って？あの黄色い服を着た女性ですよ。メガネをかけた綺麗な女性。ボビーさん、黄色の服を着ていますはフィリピン語で何ですか？
Nakadilaw des. Nakadilaw.
次へ。
So this is a PowerPoint, but like I said earlier, we now have them in Canva. So I will show you the Canva part when I introduce the Canva tour when I introduce the sample lesson. So oh, yes. Hi. So this is just a moment, please. Hi. Okay, so this is also the lesson I use for my Open Academy class, Open University class. That's why you can see it here. First, after introducing the title, I ask the students how they are, and then I tell them the schedule, and then we have a short discussion related to the lesson. We talk in Japanese, but for everyone's sake here, I translated questions to in other parts of the slide to English. So I then introduce the learning goals of the lesson. Our university uses CEFR, or the Common European Framework of Reference for Language and Teaching. In English or Japanese, the lesson about fashion, talking about someone's fashion or describing a person using by describing his fashion is around B1 level or entering the intermediate level. But for Filipino, this is around A1 to A2 level. So I'm going to explain about this again later. So before we listen to the tour, I asked the students to answer the pre-test. And then I show them some pictures related to the topic and discuss with them about this. Then I send the link of the tour to the students who would be using the goggles, and a different link showing the Canva tour for those who are using the Canva tour. So while listening to the tour, I asked the students to list down the Filipino words they heard, and then I tell them to send me the words. So the spelling, I tell them not to mind the spelling as long as they can uh, send me the words that they were able to hear, maybe as nearest to the spelling as possible. So we start the tour, and after the tour, we try to confirm the translation of the following of the expressions that we heard in the tour, and then we check the spelling together, and then I give the script to the students, the script of the tour, and then ask them to listen to the tour again so they can um, match what they heard and what they wrote. So let me share this particular tour again. So maybe you didn't hear the tour earlier. Naririnig po ba? Can you hear this part?
Yes, thank
Sige
you.
po. So this is the tour for this lesson. Museo Cordillera. It's about katutubong kasuotan. So um,
イゴロット民族はルソン島のコルディエラ州に住んでいます。イゴロット民族の伝統的なダンスや衣装はよく知られています。ボビーさん、伝統的なはフィリピン語で何ですか？
Katutubo. Katutubo.
and then we introduce nakabahag, nakakwintas, etc. So again, sorry. We go back to the sample presentation. Okay. So afterwards, we check the words and I ask them to repeat the words. So fundosyo haitemas nakabahag, skato haitemas nakapalda, necreso tsuketemas nakakwintas, etc. And then we discuss about the newly introduced grammar in this lesson. It's naka adjective. As mentioned earlier, this would be around B1 level because in Japanese, you use different verbs for different things you wear, like the top, temas, bottom, haitemas, cap, kabutemas, accessories, tsuketemas, etc. But for Filipino, it's all naka, right? So I think it's from this sentence pattern, nakasuot siya ng palda, which becomes nakapalda siya. Okay, and then I give them several examples to make their own sentences, and they can just insert the word naka, bestida siya. Okay, and then I give them a chance to make their own sentences. If they don't know the word in Filipino, I ask them to use English or Japanese. So for accessories and then colors. For A1 level, usually I tell the students not to memorize everything. I just tell them to remember their favorite words. I tell them that for most nouns, a lot of Filipinos just use English, and Filipinos in Japan, they use Japanese. So I think it's how we Filipinos speak, right? We just use the vocabulary or the language that comes to mind. So, however, if they're really interested to say everything in Filipino, that's also great. Now, if you can say more words in Filipino, it means your proficiency also goes up. So we practice some more sentences. And then towards the end, we try to talk about ourselves using the words and sentence patterns. If we have time, we have skits and dialogues. So I gave them homework, and then we answer the post-test and the after-class survey. Then we have Muni Muni or the reflection. So these are some of the questions for reflection. And then we summarize and check if we achieve our goals together. So after listening to the 3 tours, I asked my students to introduce their hometown using PowerPoint. And then after another 3 tours, I asked them to create a tour for incoming Filipino exchange students using more Filipino expressions they have learned in my class or in other Filipino classes. So I have exceeded my time, but let me share you some of my students' work. So this is after 3 tours. Oh. So just a moment. I hope this works.
今日は私のプロビンシャを案内するね。私のプロビンシャは福岡。ってことで、さよなさ。福岡！まずはカフェやデパートがマラーミな天神でタンハリアンを食べよう。空港から天神まではトレンで10分しかかからないんだよ。
わあ、とってもマラーピーだね。
Okay, so that is after 3 tours, and then after all 6 tours, this is another example.
Magandang araw.
All in Filipino now.
Estudyante kami sa Tufts. May Tufts Monument sa entrance. Maraming major language sa Tufts. May bilog na plaza sa gitna sa Tufts. Tayo na sa Sanrio Purolando. Sumakay na lang tayo ng tren.
Ang ganda. Maraming cute na karakter. Ano ang paborito mong karakter? Hello Kitty ang paborito kong karakter. Naka-rosas na vestido siya. Pero si Pom Pom Pudding ang pinakapopular na karakter.
Okay, so so there these are some of my students' outputs. I hope I was able to share something new to everyone. At least in Japan, using virtual tours are still something new. Yun lang po. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much. Domo arigatou gozaimashita.
Maraming salamat, Ma'am Flori. I'm not sure if Tita Pia is back. I see her in here, but she's been having connectivity issues. Pero maraming salamat again for sharing your experiences, Ma'am Flori. And I do like how you integrate new technology. Because those are actually the things that we're working on now. Because I am now working in big tech, and I do see all those prototypes before we release them like 3 years later on. And these are the things like this is good. This is good to see that these are getting taken advantage of in academia as well. And I, especially for the visual learners, for heritage language learners, that does help them a lot. And you did make a point earlier in your presentation, something in the lines of translanguaging, which was talked about last week, where you could take advantage of all the languages you know and just integrate them together into your language learning. Again, maraming salamat for sharing your expertise for today. And again, for our participants, let's give Ma'am Flori isang bagsak. One more time, isang bagsak. All right. Thank you again. All right, so let's move on to our next speaker. So our next presenter is an assistant professor of ethnic studies and director of liberal studies at California State University, East Bay. His work crosses the disciplines of ethnic studies education, mixed race studies, queer studies, and counseling. His research explores participatory action research in educational spaces as ways to challenge colonially constructed narratives and identities. He received his PhD in curriculum studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and his BA and MA in Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He has taught for over 13 years and has worked with students ranging from 6th grade through university level in both Honolulu and in San Francisco here in California. So let us now all welcome Dr. Raju Desai.
Hi everybody, magandang hapon, gabi, tanghali, umaga, madaling araw, kung anong oras dyan sa inyo. Thank you for being here today. Let me share my screen. Pasensya, I'm a little nervous to be going after such great presentations. Let me go ahead and share. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, so my presentation today is entitled Not Just an Elective, Filipino Language Pedagogy as Advocacy, Belonging, and Multilingual Justice in U.S. Community Colleges. A little bit of my background. So I teach ethnic studies primarily, but I have been teaching Filipino since 2010. I've taught it, I go by Kuya Raju with my students, right? My Filipino language students, I'm like, just call me Kuya. Don't worry about doctor, just Kuya na lang. I started teaching with under Dr. Leo Paz of City College San Francisco back in 2010. I've also helped bring back the Filipino language program at Balboa High School as an after-school program, and then it became a high school class that had 3 years of Filipino. It's now gone back down to just 1. I also helped develop the World Languages in Elementary Schools for Filipino and San Francisco Unified. That's at 2 elementary schools in San Francisco. And then I taught with the program at the University of Hawaii. But right now I'm at Skyline College. So I just like to name those things, especially when I teach my students, because with a name like Raju, with a face like mine, I like to give context as to, why I'm talking about teaching Filipino or why I'm teaching Filipino. So a little context of Skyline College. So Skyline College has the Kababayan Learning Community. We are a community college in San Bruno, California, which means we are a 2-year institution and do not grant a bachelor's degree. Our school has a 14% Filipino population, which is very large for a community college in the Bay Area. And our Kababayan Learning Community is 21 years strong. It's one of the longest running Filipino learning communities in California. And during the COVID pandemic with distance learning, there was a desire to collaborate across the community colleges. And there are now, I believe, 5 or 6 community college Filipino learning communities and community colleges in the state. Skyline has also had Filipino language classes since the mid-90s, and we have an ongoing relationship with the Fulbright FLTA program, and we've been fortunate to have an FLTA in our classes since, I believe, since 2003. I came in fall 2020 in the context of COVID-19 and teaching online. So prior to coming to Skyline, all of my Filipino language teaching experience has been in person, face-to-face. And then coming to Skyline, it was teaching online, and we have been consistently online up until this year. And in the fall, we're going to go back to being in person because we found that our students are getting tired of taking night classes virtually. So we're going to go back to in the daytime in person, which I'm excited about. I wanted to start off just with this question. So because we are a community college, most of our students are just fresh out of high school. Some are still in high school concurrently. The age range varies from about 16 years old to 80. My oldest student was 80 years old, but the average age is about 18 to 21. And so our students take Filipino as an elective because if you want to transfer to the UC system, you need to have language credit. So my thoughts around this is, what does it mean to teach Filipino beyond just an elective, right? And I think about this in terms of the counselors thinking, oh yeah, it's just an elective. It's not a class that matters. or that you have to take seriously. So I want to challenge that. And in my time working under Dr. Pia Arboleda at the University of Hawaii, I took her mentorship to heart. And when she described in one of her speeches as teaching Filipino, so our students can be Filipino sa puso, isip, diwa, at wika, right? Or Filipino in heart, mind, spirit, or consciousness and language. And so for me, I think that's my purpose in teaching Filipino to my students and what I want to bring into the classroom. Okay, so why Filipino language education matters in the college context in the US. So I think our school alone has a 14% Filipino population. I think particularly in the West Coast, especially in California, Washington, and Hawaii, there are so many Filipino and Filipino American students, but not many Filipino language classes. And as was mentioned by Louward, there's only one full language program, which is at the University of Hawaii. And a lot of the students on the West Coast of California don't have access to get to Hawaii or take those classes. Also, the idea of racial linguistic hierarchies, right? I hear students saying, oh, but what's the purpose or what's the point of taking Filipino? I don't need it. But as was mentioned, right, Filipino is the fourth most common language besides English in the United States. In West Coast states like Nevada, California, Alaska, it is the second most common language after Spanish. But students aren't seeing the value in it. So part of this work is to help students challenge those notions. And part of that is a result of colonization and racism in the United States, right? So thinking about the impact of colonization, diaspora, and language loss. And even, countering some of the things that happen in the families where students are taught, don't speak Filipino. I didn't want to teach you Filipino. And students internalize the inferiorization of Philippine language. And really helping students understand that language as a part of identity, intergenerational connection, and resistance. So with that, I want to incorporate some pedagogical frameworks. So first of all, culturally sustaining pedagogy, right? By Django Paris, which is about sustaining language, culture, and identity. But in my classrooms, when we talk about sustaining culture, whose culture? Because I also bring in concepts of, Imperial Manila and Tagalog hegemony, right? In a Filipino class, we want to be able to have those conversations and challenge those things and recognize that every student that comes in that is Filipino, regardless of whether or not they have a Tagalog heritage or are, of Tagalog ancestry. Also, racial linguistic perspectives by Rosa and Flores. So challenging less valuable language narratives, right? And challenging the notion of dialects. And day one, that's the first thing we talk about. And I have students affirm, I survey the students right before the class starts to find out what all our language backgrounds are. And then I have students say it out loud. My language is a language. It's not a dialect. And doing that work. I also want to bring in ethnic studies and critical pedagogy, where language is tied to history, power, and struggle. We cannot separate language from context, whether that is social, political, economic, or historical. So I start off my class with my philosophy, and I have my students see this. It's available on my syllabus. It's available on the website when they go to log into the Zoom, and we talk about it on the first day, where language learning should be fun, and that there is immeasurable value in learning Filipino. At the top of my course, at the very beginning of the semester, I want students to understand that there is value in learning Filipino, and that Filipino is just as significant or complex as any other language on the planet. I think there's notions that it's very, oh, it's just Filipino. Oh, yeah, I'll just get that through osmosis. That's not how languages work. Yes, there is some input already if you are a heritage learner and you've grown up hearing it, but that varies by individual student. There is value in actual study of the language, and that Filipino or Tagalog is just one of the many rich, complex languages that are indigenous to the islands known as the Philippines. Also, a really important one is I want my students to know is that all languages are dynamic. Just because your Lola doesn't speak like how the book is written does not mean that Lola is wrong. Because I don't want my students to follow a book and then stigmatize the people in their families. Oh, that's wrong. You're not saying that correctly. that's something I never want my students to do, and I make that very clear. And which is why I also want to challenge, the power dynamic. Who has the power in language? Is it the people who speak it or the person that's able to publish the book? And then another piece that's really important for Filipino American students, particularly Filipino American second language and heritage learners, is we need to get past the shame and stigmas that we have or have been taught to have around speaking Filipino. Because I know for some students, um, oral comprehension is very good, but being able to speak, there's a barrier. And part of that is not just about ability, there's also some emotional things, pieces that come with that. And so we really work to make the classroom a brave space for students to feel more comfortable, learn to laugh at themselves. Because a lot of my students come in being made fun of for either sounding too American when they try to speak Tagalog as little children, or being made fun of in school for having an accent and trying to unlearn the natural way their tongue formed when they were speaking Filipino as a young child. And I tell students the best way to learn a language is through practice, because I don't want my students to be afraid to make those mistakes. Like Louward mentioned, you have to make those mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. I don't want perfection. And I pulled this last one is from an indigenous scholar, an indigenous Native American scholar, who said, each time a language dies, 5 forms of rain cease to fall on the earth. So I want my students to understand the value in how the connection between language, culture, epistemology, and environment. And really to think deeply about, the beauty and power of learning Filipino or any other Philippine language. And of course, the last one, Google Translate is not your friend, because I tell students, I'm not a computer programmer. I cannot correct Google. I can correct a language learner when they make mistakes. Because Google, I have to think about, what are you trying to say? Because the mistakes are from an algorithm versus a human mistake. And I had to learn this when teaching in Hawaii, because a lot of the students would use Google Translate because they wanted to be perfect, but it actually makes it worse than if they just made the mistakes themselves. How I break it down. So actually my curriculum is very grammar based in how I break it down, because I want to give them the building blocks of language. So unit 1 is calendario, where if you are, day 1, 0 level in Filipino, you learn greetings. You learn Tagalog numbers first. The days of the week, parts of the day, umaga, tanghali, hapon, the months, say dates, and then learn your ang or subject pronouns. It's the shortest unit, and just starting to build and getting people comfortable, learning how to introduce themselves. Units 2 and 3 are actually one unit, describing. But I separate unit 3 out because I realize if I don't separate those things out, I will always get may marami, may wala, because they're using English, right? There are many, there is none. But in that unit, students are just learning how to describe themselves in their world, and their journal is they're taking what they've learned and then putting up pictures in their journal, describing their family or their friends, and describing either their house or their room. And it's a way we can build community together, get to know each other, even in a virtual space, but also seeing how they take the grammar and generate their own sentences from that. I do not give them sentence frames, but we do a lot of practice incorporating that grammar, and then they do it on their own. Unit 4, we focus on verbs, and we stay on actor-focused verbs. So one thing I think that's really important is when you are teaching Filipino Americans in the US, we cannot teach Filipino the same as in the Philippines, because the focus gets very confusing for my students. I don't mix actor and object focus in my first semester. I stick with my mag and ma verbs, let them get that grammar down. And so by unit 4, they learn to do their schedules. They learn the Spanish set of numbers, time. We talk about when to use Tagalog versus Spanish numbers, and have that conversation then when they're more solid in their language ability. And then journal 3 is them writing out their schedule, their daily routine, and then their weekly work and school schedule. And that sets us up for unit 5, where we learn all our question words and how to formulate questions. And then my students actually will interview high school students in the Philippines via Zoom, based off of the host institution of my Fulbright FLTA that semester. And that's been something that's been really great, because they get to incorporate their language on the fly. So they're in groups of 3 and they've formulated their questions in Filipino, and then they're in a Zoom with just the 3 of them and a high school student, and they have to interview and then create follow-up questions and go back and forth, and then they later on present. So in their groups of 3, they're gonna panel interview 3 different students. So each of my students will choose one of the people they've interviewed to report back on and share. And it's a way for them to also like humanize Filipino students in the Philippines. So these are my students are college students and they're interviewing high school students, and they're so afraid to interview high school students in the Philippines. I've had like 23-year-old students. Oh my God, I'm gonna interview somebody. What are they gonna say? What if they don't like me? I'm telling them you're interviewing a 16-year-old. It's gonna be okay. These students are great and they have so much fun and they get excited and they want to keep communication. And so it's a way to also like have them connect to people in the Philippines in ways that they may not do with their own families, having regular communication and exchanging social media. And then Unit 6, we finally start to begin to touch on object-focused verbs using gusto, ayaw, kailangan, and getting to like use more advanced language, prepping them for second semester Philly 120, where we focus more on object-focused verbs. In terms of pedagogical strategies, I think about community cultural wealth and storytelling. So incorporating, the journals where they're talking about themselves, having them do regular reflections on different things, whether it's videos we show in the beginning, on questions I would ask them about contemporary issues, bringing in different cuento, and then having them interview. Translanguaging and multilingual practices. So validating language mixing allows students to bring in their own, heritage languages within the space if they don't know the Filipino root word, using the magpanlape with an English word to help them, and challenging the notion of, purity versus real life language. In my second semester, I talk about the divergence between formal Filipino and spoken Filipino, and asking students, what are you using your Filipino for? Because if you are taking this class to learn Filipino to speak with your family, then you perhaps shouldn't be sounding so formal, right? You want to match the context that you're going to be using your Filipino. And also normalizing different levels of proficiency, because I have some students that go back and forth between the Philippines and the US regularly in terms of like living here for 3 years and going back home for a year and then coming back. Some students who have never been to the Philippines. I have some students who are not Filipino, all in one virtual space. So it's not even just a physical classroom, but it's also on Zoom. So taking all those different levels and also incorporating things like technology issues, right? Wi-Fi lags, etc. And then ethnic studies integration. And with that, I think about talking about the social context, but also validating the lived experiences of my students. And so I'm going to show you some examples of how I've incorporated this. First, when I was teaching in Hawaii, I was teaching mostly second year Filipino 201. And the context of being Filipino in Hawaii is very different than it is on the West Coast. And because of the experiences and treatment of Filipinos in Hawaii historically, there is a different sense of what it means to be Filipino. And that was a culture shock for me coming from California to Hawaii. And so I had to think about ways to engage my students, because I could see my students kind of shutting down at times when it would come to certain topics. So I was like, how do I get students to buy in and realize that Filipino is important in this context? So I had to do some research and connect. And a lot of my language pedagogy is actually influenced by taking Hawaiian language at the University of Hawaii as well. So I asked my students, who is she and what does she have to do with learning Filipino? This is the native Hawaiian goddess Pele, who is the goddess of the volcano. And all the students knew who she was. But if I was to put up any Filipino deity, they wouldn't know who that was, right? But they know who this is because there is more clout. In the context of Hawaii, Native Hawaiians have more clout in that space. And so I asked them, I was like, well, okay, you know who she is, but you don't know who Daragang Magayon, right? So I talked about her story and I thought about in the context, because we're teaching in the context of Hawaii, what is the context of this place. And there's a practice called, ka'al, which is a migration story that is found throughout the Pacific Islands. And in Hawaii, it's called ka'al. And so I said, what is her story? She was forced away from her homeland. She had a journey. She died and she was reborn. And I told my students, I said, her story is a metaphor for the Filipino experience in Hawaii, the push and pull factors of migration, an actual journey. And I said, maybe it's not a physical death, but a metaphoric death. Think about how your parents are here in Hawaii every day, focusing on work, etc. How are they when they go back to the Philippines? Oh, they're different. It's lighter. I said, yes, there's a metaphoric death by living in America versus when you get to go back in your homeland. And then I tell my students, so think about you learning Filipino is a way to engage that part of your parents or your lola or whoever in your family that lies dormant while they are here in America away from their homeland. And that's the value of learning Filipino. And it was getting that buy-in for students to really understand, having a deeper connection to their purpose in learning Filipino. And I think that's something we don't necessarily talk about enough. We have to really help our students understand their purpose in learning Filipino versus it's just learning a language, right? It's more than an elective. In terms of resources, we don't have a lot of resources. A lot of the resources out there are not suitable for the different levels of students that we have in one context. So I make a lot of dialogues and I pull dialogues from, my own family experiences, things my students can relate to. I'm very sarcastic in terms of my humor, so my dialogues are very sarcastic. When I'm trying to show more advanced grammar structures, comparative and superlative adjectives, I created this dialogue. So you have like mas maasim, pinakamaasim, nakakainis, ang bastos-bastos, all those different verbs, adjective structures, and in one dialogue, so students can see how it works, and then they try to play with it on their own. Another example I think about in terms of the social context, I think about when I was in Hawaii, we have song contest or once a year, and we're given different kundiman to have our students sing. And I was assigned ang pipit, which if we know that song, the kundiman, it's a very happy, cheerful song, even though if you actually look at the lyrics, it's really sad. And I was teaching during the time of all the EJKs. And in that context, I said, do we want to sing a happy song about violence? And I asked my students, let's look at this song. And I had them analyze the lyrics. And then my students said, Mamang kay lupit, ang puso mo'y di na nahabag. Pag pumanaw ang buhay ko, may isang pipit na iiyak. And then I showed them a picture of a mother holding her child. When my students sang, they sang it in a they really thought about the lyrics and thought about what they were saying. They ignored the context of the original recording of the song and sang it. And then they were told by the judges, that's not the right way to sing the song. I want us to challenge that kind of thinking, right? And we need to incorporate the context. We cannot separate Filipino from the context. What do we want our students to use Filipino for? We want them to speak out against injustice. We want them to advocate for a progressive change in their local context, but also in the Philippines. We want our students to go back, right? We want our students to do more than just order, barbecue, lumpia, and pancit in a restaurant. There's use for that too, but we want more than that for our students. And thank you, Jose Marie, for saying that. Yes. So I am going to talk about the Toboso 19 who are being villainized in the media and bring it up in my Filipino class, because why would I not, right? When I show videos, I show them, films by May Paner or Juana Change. In October, it's Filipino American History Month, but it's also Buwan ng Katutubo in the Philippines. So I let my students hear first-hand accounts from Katutubo in their own words, whether it's in Filipino or in their languages with Filipino and English subtitles, because I think those things are important. And I think we need to talk about the ongoing experiences of, everyone in the Philippines. We can't just talk about Filipino from a specifically Manila perspective or a specifically urban perspective, because the Philippines is much more than that. And our wealth and beauty is in our diversity. So just some cultural considerations in teaching Filipino language, the diversity within the concept of Filipino, the colonial and diasporic context, whether it's social, political, historical, economic, thinking about family and intergenerational dynamics and helping students understand their purpose in learning Filipino, relational pedagogy, and then more curricular resources that are suitable for students of different levels. I think because if we get a source from the Philippines, that's for elementary Filipino, it's not elementary level for Filipino Americans. And that's something that we really need to work on developing. Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat, Kuya Raju. Again, isang bagsak for Kuya Raju. One more time, isang bagsak. All right. Thank you again for sharing your experiences in teaching the Filipino language, especially in the Bay Area. And I really do like what you said earlier, that with the whole context of my language is a language and not a dialect, because then a lot of Filipinos that actually immigrated here to the US think that if they don't speak Filipino or they don't speak Tagalog, that their language that they speak is a dialect. And I often have to correct my mom as well, because my mom speaks Ilocano. And then when she says that, oh, I speak a dialect, it's like, Ilocano is not a dialect. Ilocano is a language. And so it's like the other coworkers that my mom have worked with, and they speak Cebuano, and then they said, oh, it's a dialect, it's Cebuano. It's like, no, it's not a dialect, it is a language. Because then there are variations of it as well. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. And we are moving on to our open forum now, and we do have some questions in there. So we encourage all our speakers, the first couple as well, to join us and turn on their videos again for questions over here. But I'm not sure if Kuya Raj, you just answered that question from Susana Layog, but for everybody else, let me just read this real quick. So for this phrase, ang batang makulit ay pinapalo sa puwet, meaning a kid who is hard-headed or stubborn. As a stubborn child gets hit in the buttocks. Doesn't seem normalization of corporal punishment get you in trouble with parents and school authorities. Not a judgment, but a sincere question.
So I use that when I teach my college students. So I don't have to deal with parents as much, but I use it. I actually started using that because one year my class, my student, I opened the Zoom early for office hours, and 5 students were on there and they were talking about things. And one student was talking about Paolo. And then my students started trauma bonding. And I stopped and I said, wait. I was like, you realize this is problematic. We're all bonding over being Paolo as kids. It's like, let's problematize this. But also that's from my second semester. So we start off by using adjectives that use a structure similar to object focus. So ang ganda ng versus maganda ang. So I start doing that. So I threw that in that construction because it's an introduction of object focus, pinapalo. So I kind of did it for both. And then we do have a conversation after to talk about, the dynamic between ate and bunso.
Thank you, Kuya Raj. There was another question earlier for Ma'am Flori, but I think she already answered it in the chat. So if you guys from our audience, and I do see here we have grown from just about 50 something earlier, we now have almost 160 participants in this Zoom meeting. So go ahead and please drop your questions or even your comments, drop them in the chat so then our speakers can address your questions. It looks like we have a question from Denver. Povero, go ahead and please unmute yourself.
Magandang araw po sa bawat isa po sa ating lahat. Thank you po for giving us the opportunity to attend. I'm Denver Hovero po from currently a secondary education major in social studies student from the Philippine Normal University. the National Center for Teacher Education. At first, I thought the webinar is about, for example, about discussing, of course, promoting Philippine language, of course, Philippine history in the local context. But I am very happy to hear the stories that this is more of a internationalization, or more of the of discussing the diaspora of our language and our history. So I am very thankful for this opportunity. And if I may share some experiences here in our university, we have also our foreign students that are taking, for example, from students from United Arab Emirates, since UAE has a majority of Filipino there. Are currently learning the Filipino language here in our university, and also some Belgian students and Japanese students. And this is my, it's quite touching, since my advocacy is also local history and promoting kasaysayang pagpuok. And it's fascinating to hear that our language, our identity is being strengthened through you. So the very meaning of being a Filipino transcends not only by blood or by the place that we are born, because being Filipino is choosing to promote or to live the Filipino language, the Filipino identity and tradition. So maraming salamat po sa inyo pong tagapagtaguyod ng ating wika, ng ating kultura, at ng ating pagka-Pilipino. Currently, I am taking a thesis po, a scoping review about the TPAC framework. So it's more of a education, teacher education po, about the TPAC framework in social studies education. And I will try to, hopefully I can ask for your papers or your presentations, so I can include it in our scoping review, since I believe that even though it's quite language oriented or linguistic oriented, I think we can thread it and thematize it in the social studies education. Especially you are combining contextual pedagogies, because you are talking about local history, local culture, or oral traditions, but also the utilization of technology such as the virtual tours and virtual museums. So thankfully, I am thankful for attending this webinar. So you can it can be also helpful for my thesis, for our thesis in my current semester today. Maraming salamat po. Mabuhay po kayo. Thank you po.
Maraming salamat. Perhaps Flori and Louward could respond.
Just sharing, yeah, I can share the, thank you for that comment, Sir Denver. I can share the link to our, or the title of the presentation, the research we did, and yes, please do include them in your study. I'll share in the chat box. Ano po yan? Thank you.
Yeah, Louward.
Oh, in my case, because it's not yet a published paper, so I cannot share technically. Yeah, so, but if he wants like some resources, especially in like the Filipino programs from the US, I'm happy to share those. But again, based on what I know with scoping reviews, it's usually contextualized and localized, so it's within Philippine context. So I'm not sure how applicable the US context would be in that scoping review.
Thank you. Flori has already responded, I know, on the chat, but perhaps you could again tell us the rest of the participants, in your own experience, what are the opportunities and challenges you encountered in teaching Filipino in Japan?
Okay, sige po. Yeah, first of all, yeah, the language, as I have shared, and maybe Tita Pia already experienced it before. Not many students understand English well, so of course we can explain in English, and but yeah, but afterwards I would discover that they did not actually understand my explanation. And now students are, when I started using Japanese to explain things in class, and the comments were like, oh, it's good because now I can understand compared to the other teachers. So something. Um, we did not understand. Um, we yeah, we had a hard time understanding in English. So language. Yeah, second one is motivation. So as I mentioned earlier, not all our students, chose Filipino as what Kuya Raju said. It's a minor language in Japan. No, the Filipino community is the fourth largest community in Japan, but still the Filipino language is minor. So they don't. A lot of them would. They don't think Filipino is that important, and then they have this notion of Filipinos, we all know how to speak English. So when they go to the Philippines, they don't really need to speak Filipino. So what's the purpose? So, motivating them to understand the value of learning Filipino. And if I can add, there are very few materials about the teaching Filipino, right? Or maybe even teaching the Filipino grammar or understanding the Filipino grammar. Even now, a lot of us would go back to Shakhtar and Otanes, right? So yeah, so if students have questions, um, it's also I get panicky because how do I explain this? I can understand it, but how do I make them understand some certain grammar points? I think teacher Imi Sensei from University of Osaka is here. Thank for her. I would like to thank her for creating materials, especially for the younger students. So yun, we need teachers who can develop materials. Thank you very much.
I think the difference between when I was teaching in Osaka, since I didn't speak Japanese, there was only Filipino and no intervening language. So they had to try and say it in Filipino. In Hawaii, since there's English as an intervening language, then a lot of English words are incorporated into their language. But again, as we have seen, we also recognize the voice of the people in the diaspora. So we cannot ask them to speak like pure Filipino as if they lived in the Philippines, because even our Filipino students in Manila don't, or in the Philippines, do not speak pure Filipino in that sense anymore. So thank you so much for your sharing your experience. I have a question for Kuya Raju and Kuya Louward. Really, how do we address other issues that we see in our like recent events in our history? You've already started that, Kuya Raju, when you talked about pipit, So one thing about that is why are we choosing I know that was like required, but why are we choosing these folk songs without actually explaining context, right? And then the other issue there is, if we're in Hawaii or in continental US, we're already here, so why should we care about what is happening in the Philippines? We're probably never going to go back there or have never been. So maybe you could talk a little more about that since you've started that discussion. Let's start with Kuya Raju, then Kuya Louward.
I think for me, one of my mentors, Dr. Alison Tintinacocubales, always talks about you got to think about the personal, local, and global. And everything that happens to anywhere. We're all connected no matter what globally, and everything happens everywhere. Like, why are Filipinos in America? Because of what happened in the Philippines, because of what America did and did in the Philippines. Um, for me, I don't want to separate anything. Like if my students are going to complain about gas prices here, then I'll talk about, okay, and how does that impact, how does what America is doing in the Middle East impact what's happening to Filipinos in the Philippines right now? And let's watch a news report about the gas prices in the Philippines and how people, some Jeeps drivers can't drive and make a living. And so when we think about stuff, so, also thinking about, yes, you're Filipino American, but what you do, what you vote for here has impacts on your family in the Philippines. And I was told before, oh, like masyadong Filipino American studies yung klase mo, hindi pang Filipino language. But what's the difference? Another example, when I talk about the mang panlape, when I do third semester Filipino, a lot of our violent terms, we mentioned corporal punishment, have the mang panlape in front of it. So before that, I teach maka and makapag. And then I ask my students after they learn the mang panlape, kapag may mang aapi sa'yo, ano ang magagawa mo? And then use yourself to answer it. And I think we need to do that in Filipino language classes because otherwise, what I see in the old books, it's all about tourism. And we're just perpetuating colonial structures and exploitation of the Philippines.
Salamat. I particularly like, and I've seen this in person, when Kuya Raju teaches Maki, he includes Maki Baka. I love it. Thank you. Kuya Louward.
So for me, because the heritage program, the Filipino program here at Yale is a heritage program, so all of my students are heritage language learners of Filipino. And then Yale is particularly known for some of their stances politically and ideologically. So a lot of my students tend to gravitate towards those topics. And then recently we had like invited talks and film screening on like everything and anything Filipino, like for example, headhunting, which is an indigenous practice before. And then for our advanced Filipino class, we've talked about the labor policy during the 80s, during the martial law, because that was what started the whole labor export and then the OFWs. But then that was just a byproduct of the labor policy during the Commonwealth, during the American period. And then we went back further in history to like the Thomasites sending Americans to the Philippines that shaped basically Philippine education. And then in the context of Yale, 15 people from Yale were part of Thomasites, and we actually discussed in class those impacts. So similar to like Raju, for me, my stance is like make things personal because for them they need to. So usually when I start my very first lesson in any of the Filipino classes here at Yale, I tell them because you're learning Filipino, you need to learn the good and the bad of our people. We need to know the good and the bad of our history. And then especially as students of Yale, of an Ivy institution, you need to be more hyper aware and conscious of both the harms and the good of everything that is happening around you, because I tell them you are privileged students that have resources that a lot of learners don't have. So for us, when we started the program here, like last fall, a lot of our advocacy was like the Filipino program here is an act of decolonization. It's an act of reclaiming back what was taken away from Filipinos in the diaspora and in the Philippines. Because, I mean, the reason why Filipinos love English and then tends to prioritize English over other languages was because of the language policy during the American colonial period. So there's a lot of things that are interconnected. And for us, we don't try to avoid the contentious topics, but we try to unpack it and connect it to language. Like, because one of the common themes that my students keep on ranting every single time was, we didn't learn Filipino because our parent was XYZ. And I'm like, well, you're adults now and we have classes. So you have agency now to learn Filipino, and some of you are not taking it. So who's to blame now? But no, that's a different discourse. But then I was, because my point to them was like, you can always regain your agency, but the first step is always one, acknowledging the issues, and second, reclaiming back what was taken from you. And that's why it's important for them to realize that, and this is why I'm very particular with grammar, because like one of the things we discussed in class was like, if you're very particular with English and how you speak and learn English, and you're like that when you learn Japanese, you're like that when you learn Mandarin or you learn Spanish and everything that you love learning first before Filipino, you should respect and learn how to love our heritage language in the same way that you learn and love your other languages. Because Filipino deserves that respect. Filipino deserves that care. So that's why we need to treat Filipino in the same way as you treat your other beloved languages, because Filipino is not beneath it. So that's why, yeah, we're very particular with a lot of things, at least with our program here. But anyways, I think that's a different topic. But yeah.
Maraming salamat, Kuya Louward. Sorry we don't have time for questions, but I'd like to give our speakers one last chance to say their final short messages, including to address the issue of, like, in the Philippines, they don't even want us to teach Filipino anymore. It's no longer a priority. So maybe, or if you don't want to answer that question, kindly just give us your final messages for our participants today, starting with Miss Flori.
Oh, that's a big. Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me here. Again, thank you for having me here. Final message. So even I agree with the other presenters. I also think that we should be proud of our career. First of all, we should be proud as Filipino teachers. I think that also reflects how we teach our students. And even if you're just teaching basic or elementary Filipino, we should insert the values of learning the Filipino language. And it's not only about teaching them the grammar, but also teaching them about our culture, our pride as Filipinos. And I think I agree with all of them that Filipino learning Filipino is we should focus on motivating our students why they should learn Filipino. They should have the pride in learning Filipino. I think that's the first one we should give to our students. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat po, Flori Sensei. Kuya Raju.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I'm really happy to be on this panel with these other amazing scholars and to hear from you all. Yeah, we need to help our students find their purpose and motivation and learn to love Filipino language and their Filipino identity, and also be comfortable talking about the good and the bad in our history, whether they're in the diaspora or in the Philippines, right? Not just Filipino, but also their heritage language too. Yeah.
Maraming salamat. Hugs. Kuya Louward.
Well, for me, I always tell my students like everyone has a different relationship with Filipino and their Filipino-ness, whether it's because of familiar trauma, intergenerational trauma, colonial trauma, or whatever trauma. So some people have positive relationship with their Filipino-ness, some have negative. So we need to allow and give space for people to resolve and address those issues personally, internally, so that they learn how to appreciate and love themselves as Filipinos, and that's when they open themselves up to learn the language, because it's a process, and everyone have their own baggages, especially our students here. in the diaspora. So that's why a lot of our activities target different things. Like if your connection is with food, okay, let's eat. Even though personally I don't advocate lumpia and pancit, let's go cook lumpia, wrap lumpia, cook pancit. Or if it's karaoke, let's all sing. Because maybe after you sing, after you eat pancit, you will think, oh, maybe I should learn the language next. So the reclamation process is a slow process, but it always starts from the personal. Yeah, so.
Maraming salamat. Thank you so very much for first for our
Can I just say
participants for your
things?
for your active participation and thank you sa ating mga minamahal na mga speakers. Miss Flori Palma Hill, Dr. Raju Desai, Dr. Louward Zubiri. Maraming salamat po. Isang bagsak, isang bagsak, isang bagsak.
Again, maraming salamat
Back to you, Markee.
Yeah, yes, Tita. Maraming salamat again to all our speakers. And I think we have someone who had raised their hand. If you could just put in your question into the chat, Miss Felicitas Angel, if you could just put your question in the chat, maybe one of our panelists can answer your question. Unfortunately, we do have to move on to the next part of our lecture for today. And again, if any of you want to post our event today on your social media, please don't forget to use our official hashtag Pamana ng Lahi. And Tita Pia, go ahead and you can introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so very much, Markee. Our next speaker is a poet, transdisciplinary writer, artist, and educator whose work centers on the integrity of the writer as artist, storyteller, and cultural producer. Their writing investigates queer diasporic identity, grief work, the echoes of severed ancestral lineages, reimagined ecologies and ritual, and the intimacies of survivorship towards a liberated diaspora. They work across poetry, creative nonfiction, and multimedia art practices. They are the author of Nature Felt But Never Apprehended, All Things Lose Thousands of Times, and Maroon. Their work has appeared in the Academy of American Poets, Michigan Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. They have received fellowships and awards from Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, Hedgebrook, Baldwin for the Arts, Condiman, and the Fine Arts Work Center, among others. They are an associate professor of creative writing at California State University, San Bernardino. Please welcome poet Angela Penaredondo.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining from. I'm Angela Penaredondo. Thank you so much, Pia, for that warm introduction and welcome. And I'm really honored to be here with everybody in this international dialogue on pedagogy, on Filipino culture and language, and to just be part of the Pamana ng Lahi teacher training program. It's such a pleasure, so thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and please let me know if for some reason it looks lopsided or weird, because I would like to know. So if it looks okay, can everybody see that all right? Does anyone need me to make it big?
Yes, it's all right.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you, Angela. Thanks.
Thanks. All right, so the title of my presentation is Artists in the Room, Invitation into Becoming. And the S is an intentional move, the S in the parentheses. And it's because I want to highlight not just about the artist in terms of speaking about myself, but also what it means to invite the student as artists, the instructor and educator as artists. And so I wanted to kind of move into that space. And just a little bit about me before I begin in terms of my teaching philosophy. I am a published poet, writer, educator, artist scholar. I am invested in the practice of craft, literary craft, and also the creative process and their relationship to imagination and emotional intelligence. So in my classes, I offer interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, feminist, learner-centered approaches to creative writing studies, and literary analysis. I value and guide my students through dialogic, collaborative, reflective, inquiry-driven, and also experimental literary practices. So first, I wanted to start with a kind of reframe. And I think this might be connected in some direct or indirect way to what some of the presenters have been talking about in terms of when one is trying to, when there's a reclamation that is necessary to happen for students in the classroom. And in this case, I kind of want to reframe the perspective of the artist, because I think it really changes the approach when we're thinking about teaching creative writing. And in my presentation, I just want to make a note that I'll be highlighting predominantly poetry. However, a lot of these things can be, transferred over to other creative writing genres, whether it's fiction, creative nonfiction, and other subgenres of creative writing. So when we say the word artist, right, I think for many of us or many folks out there in various cultures, there's kind of this kind of historical baggage. At least that's how it was in my personal experience as a Filipina and as a Filipino American, where in mainstream culture has somehow produced this very particular image of the artist as romantic or solitary or this kind of suffering outsider, and almost giving the artist this kind of mythical kind of presence that's outside of ordinary life, right? Misunderstood, marginalized, and inspired, self-possessed. And although I do want to say there is some partial truth to that, and artists have been marginalized, but the work of making art has been devalued and pushed to the edges of what society has considered, or mainstream society has considered to be maybe serious or productive. And I mean, look, we are living in a very different moment now where art making has become more accessible through advanced technology and than any point in history, right? And the boundaries of the creative process and the artistic medium are pretty vast. And that's definitely something. And so I think it's, the artist in the classroom, but also the living artist who has a ongoing and continuous practice with their craft. In this case, again, I'm talking about creative writing, but again, this also can traverse over not only different creative writing practices, but also artistic practices. And so we're looking at the artist who studies and practices their form, knows the history, and keeps showing up in dialogue and in community with other artists and other various people in the community, other community members. And so this kind of reframing of the artist or the poet or the writer in the classroom this pivot kind of brings that experience or that embodiment with a more intentional and disciplined practice. And that's something that I like to bring to the classroom. And so the role of artists as, storyteller, I think this was mentioned before, the idea of storytelling, about that the artist can embody this role, right? The story, the one who passes down kind of like family history or cultural history or, mythological stories or what have you. And also the artist as a cultural producer, right? The one who not only responds to culture, but becomes an active member in produce the production of culture as well, whether it's dance or singing or you know, textiles or even content creation, right? And then we also have the artist as truth teller. And this is an interesting embodiment that I like to talk to my students about in terms of the truth teller. So this artist who is connected to also a kind of justice forward, social justice, transformative justice kind of thinking, and is able to somehow, you know, think of truth as not just a singular form, but to think of truth as multiple truths, right? Something that more nuanced. And thus the artist becomes this active citizen of the world and part of, you know, the societal fabric, which I feel is a much more grounded and kind of empowered embodiment rather than a romantic one. And so in this talk, I'd like to invite, you know, other educators and learners to see what it might mean to embody and, you know, feel the edges of your artist self. And one practical thing that I do want to follow from this is investing in the work of living writers, living poets, living artists as part of your classroom curriculum, as part of your reading lists, right? And not just the canon. I do value the canon on many levels. However, I think this kind of necessary integration is important when we're also thinking of working from the bottom up, but also wanting to kind of inspire students to see actual living artists who are working and producing and publishing, poets who are writing today, kind of giving a much more real life, tangible experience. And at the same time, as the teacher, you're also sort of supporting that kind of literary heritage and that lineage of who is writing now, right? And so, and I do feel that recognition is such a powerful act of teaching. Okay, had to put my timer on for a second. Please, if I go on, feel free, Pia, to like tag me and tell me to stop. Okay, so I want to talk about curiosity, craft, and creativity. Because I see these aspects as equally important, and they have this indispensable relationship when we're thinking about creative writing, when we're thinking about literary analysis, but also when we're thinking about embodying or experimenting with embodying, you know, the student as artist, the teacher as artist, right? And knowing that, you know, one component can't exist without the other. And this is a form of knowledge building, really, in terms of combining these two components. I do want to start with curiosity because I think it can be a little bit of an underrated element of the three. And so curiosity, I want us to consider about what curiosity might mean in terms of thinking of curiosity as a muscle that needs to be trained, and that it can atrophy if you don't use it, right? And this is something that I always want to let my students kind of know or learn right in the beginning as part of their foundational kind of learnings of creative writing and or poetry, right? That curiosity is kind of one of the foundational kind of like anchor points. And I talk to my students in terms of elevating that curiosity, that what it means for them, and that it will also entail them to embrace or accept and or feel vulnerability, right? And not really performative vulnerability, but like real vulnerability, right? To sit with the feeling of uncertainty, to sit with the feeling of doubt as part of the process, rather than this is a sign that something is wrong, right? Kind of making friends with these feelings, right? You know, and so, and And I also want to highlight that doubt is not an enemy of creative writing, and not an enemy to the artist as well, even though it might feel at times really, really difficult. But like reframing that doubt is actually where the most interesting work live. And when you're certain about something, you kind of shut down, you kind of close down. But when there's uncertainty, there is this possibility of excavation, possibility of exploration. And the searching part is part of the poem itself. And so I ask my students, I ask myself to develop a close relationship with, curiosity, with doubt, and thus also leading into the next subject that I want to talk about, which is develop a relationship with one's senses. And so yes. So when it comes to connecting to literary craft through our body, this also means like activating our perception, meaning activating the way in which we experience and see the world. For some of us, it's a lot easier than others, but it's also there's many of us that, maybe are not as embodied, as we think we are. So being or embodying that art or the artist is really a practice in being present. And so I also wanted to show this slide here because this is the artwork of the sculpture of Kiki Smith. And, we have here this sculpture of a body bending forward, and how the body is not just decoration, but can be at this site of exploration, of history, of feeling, feeling out the world where words haven't formed yet, right? So when we are bringing our physical selves to the page, the hand that holds the pen, the chest that tightens around a painful memory, right? And all the things that sometimes we don't always pay attention to with what's happening here, because we might be always on our phone or in our heads thinking about other things, right? And so literary craft is not just intellectual exercise, right? It is also a bodily one. And when we're teaching something like creative writing or poetry or story, we're inviting our students to activate that kind of perception, that kind of connection, saying, hey, let's pay attention, not only with our minds, but with our whole selves and, our sensory details. And so that leads me to the next slide. And so I'm presenting this quote by the Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca. And yes, I want to briefly acknowledge something before sharing Lorca's quote. I know he's a Spanish writer, Spain being one of the former colonies of the Philippines over, hundreds and hundreds of years. But I don't bring his words lightly or without awareness of this history, because Lorca himself was a person who lived at the margins of his society, queer, anti-fascist, in deep solidarity with the Roma people of Spain, and ultimately murdered by Franco's fascist regime, right? For who he was, right? And what he believed. And he knew what it meant to be criminalized, erased, and silenced. And so I wanted to offer these words, which is his famous words of, a poet must be a professor of the five senses and must open doors among them, right? And so, yes. So when we're thinking about moving from curiosity to something when it comes to craft, I think this transition, I want to bring into light the sensorial and the specific. And I even want to just take a moment to even look at this slide here, the image on the right. This is a photograph by the photographer Levin Bliss, and a very well-known nature photographer. And in this particular series, he focuses on, seeds, on the hidden life of seeds. And I'm showing this because it does something visually about what I want to talk about in terms of craft concept. He gets close to the subject, Um, and he also becomes it in a way, right? So that kind of precision, that kind of closeness, and that refusal to stay at a comfortable distance is what I'm thinking about when I want to stress about sensorial and specificity. So when we write a poem, we engage through our five senses, right? Our five senses being sight, smell, sound, taste, touch, and also our keen observation through specificity, meaning we bring name to the details, right? We actually access like descriptive, concrete language through appealing directly to the senses, right? What can you hear, smell, taste, or touch? Like a flower is not just a flower, right? It can be an orchid, a sampaguita, right? A tree is not just a tree. It can be a Norway maple, a cedar tree, a banyan tree, right? Like a pine tree or an old oak tree that's been growing in your grandmother's backyard for years, right? And so this kind of exactness is what gives a poem texture, right? And hopefully what also invites the student or the learner into a place, into the creative process, right? Another thing that exactness does is it provides a kind of cultural weight and embodied presence to a poem or to a story. It locates the poem where it is in real body, in real life, and in real community, right? And also specificity can also act as a kind of cultural affirmation, right? When a Filipino writes about something specific, like a cultural dish, or something else, then rather saying the more generalized term, then we're putting power to a name, we're giving it validity, right? My language is precise enough, right, to carry it, right? And so when we write from a safe place, we actually remove ourselves from generalization. And what I like to encourage my students to do is to actually kind of resist generalization or challenge it, or to move towards specificity. And presence makes specificity possible. And teaching students to be present on the page means, again, to inhabit what they're writing rather than just reporting it from a distance. So this brings me to a couple poets, Filipino poets of the diaspora, Filipino American poets, that I want to introduce. Maybe some of you know these writers. Unfortunately, we won't get a chance to read the full poem here, but what I was able to do was extrapolate some lines from the poem and talk about some of the components of curiosity, creativity, and craft that I'm thinking about. So the first poem is Abundance by Rick Barrett, who is a Filipino American poet, and whose work, specifically this poem Abundance, is about return. It's about, returning back, and the poem kind of braids around his childhood story of immigration to the Philippines. And we get taken into the classroom, and which is kind of interesting because he kind of explains his experience within the classroom with the teacher, and it involves him kind of engaging in an assignment where he sees like a jar of rice sorted in many colors, and then the poem weaves from this object to a memory that he has of someone he loves, and it becomes this kind of meditative poem on patience and memory and migration, but also how these very nuanced experiences, can be this form of abundance or enrichment. And in one of the lines here that is on where I want to provide, that is an example of tactile specificity. He writes, walking the neighborhood's sleeping streets at dawn, my hands black from newsprint, stung by the rubber bands that has always snapped, right? And so we see in this kind of like one line that if you were to give ourselves more time to read, and I know I'm kind of talking within a time space here, but hopefully some of us can see that there is not only an image that maybe we can allow ourselves to imagine with the hands in the newsprint, but also maybe other sensory details such as touch, right? Maybe even the smell, right? The smell of newsprint, right? And then he also has another line that I feel is a really great example of curiosity, but that how curiosity can also be an act of kind of sustained attention. And in the poem, he writes, I had the thought that the space between the lines in the poem was like the space between two people facing each other on a bed. And I really, really love this line because we have here, you know, this moment where he provides us, where we see the I or the speaker in the poem, like providing us this sense of curiosity where he's paying attention to a moment, right? He's paying attention to a moment and he starts to compare like an actual poem itself to almost like a lived experience or an image within one sentence, right? So even in this line, there is this element of both curiosity in the speaker, but also craft that the writer is somehow mastering in this line. And the last line I want to share from Rick Barrow's poem Abundance has like comparison and also the sensorial element, which is the bloom in your senses like biting into a fennel seed. Such a short line, and we see here this kind of direct comparison between sensing a bloom and biting into a fennel seed. But here we have really like true specificity, right? Where he's not just calling out any seed, he calls out a fennel seed. And for folks that have, you know, maybe tasted fennel, I don't know, maybe you don't, maybe it's not your thing to bite into a raw fennel seed, but, you know, just humor me. But when you do, it does have a really specific taste. It's herbaceous, it's spicy, you know, it's, you know, sometimes it's not the most common taste when you think of biting into a seed, but, you know, it gives, you know, the space or the line a really specific kind of element. The next poet that I want to introduce is Janice Sapigao. And Janice Sapigao is also a Filipino-American poet, specifically from California, Northern California, the Bay Area. And I wanted to bring this poem specifically because this poem kind of, while the poem Abundance by Rick Barrett moves from the internal out, right? Silhouette by Sapigao kind of moves from the external senses inward, right? And this particular poem moves through actually her community or the speaker's community of women and their relationship to plants and to each other and homes, the homes that they've made together, the homes that they made independently. And it also arrives at the end quietly, but also devastatingly at the speaker's death, or like the speaker's death of her mother, excuse me. And so in terms of social specificity, the poem starts with the same sister who once dug a heel into a man's oblique now steals time with me off of suburban bushes after brunch. That's a really muscular line, right? And it's also kind of a choppy musical one. But one of the things I want to really take note are, you know, possibly the three kind of distinct sensory details and moments compressed just in these lines, or in this case, for you to see the poem, they would be three separate lines within a stanza. And it could be the sense of feeling like how you would feel like a heel dug into one's rib, or perhaps the smell when you smell a particular wild herb that you're familiar with, right? And how she also describes the bushes as suburban bushes. It gives it another layer of imagery. It's not bushes from, I don't know, a national park or from us that are in the store or across the street from the garbage heap. It's suburban bushes, so it's very particular, right? It makes you kind of think, and it kind of, kind of exercises your imagination and invites you into the poem. The other line, when thinking about kind of this heightened perception, again, elevating curiosity, and incorporating that into a poem, Sakbigal writes, how delicately the petals hang off their stakes like gold glass bangles on wrists against disco lights, right? And so here there's like a lot of surprise in this metaphor of comparing petals to gold bangles, right? But also it gives another kind of cultural musical element against disco lights, right? So we have very specific details that create this world for the speaker, right? And also this, hopefully, this encouragement to what it might mean for us to engage our students in working that closely with their own memory and with their own life. And lastly, because the poem does move into a more elegiac kind of ending, a more sort of somber ending about grief, the poem ends with, my mother is a seed, the first woman I cannot unplant. So, again, going back into specificity here, naming the one who has passed, the mother, right? The mother. And who is the mother? The first woman I cannot unplant. We have, Janice really like thinking about how do I write about, or the speaker, I'm sorry, the speaker sort of exploring what it might mean to create a kind of image about an emotion that feels so immense, like sadness or grief in the body, right? And so, yeah. All right. So let's go to some prompts. So I want us to think when we're thinking about prompts, in the classroom, we're thinking about, how do we get our students into even writing? There's a lot of, again, uncertainty, insecurity there. I do like prompts because I also think about prompts as an invitation, right? Meaning that, it's almost like not an assignment, right? It's an invitation, like an opening, a gateway, an open door. And it doesn't tell you what to do on the other side. You kind of ask this, it's kind of the student's kind of experiment or, a responsibility to kind of fulfill that. But instead the prompt says, come in, right? There might be something for you here. So the prompt as invitation and writing invitations to bring into your classroom. And so 3 prompts that I wanted to just present, and these are more exploratory generative prompts, again, getting for students to college students, whether they're college students or in a high school or in what have you, to kind of just get into thinking about curiosity, thinking about perception and engagement with the world. One is the object. I actually did this in 3 categories. The first category is the object, sort of asking a student to choose an object within arm's reach. If there is no object within arm's reach, it could be an object that has some kind of meaning to them. That has some kind of meaningful relationship. And I always say, there's always a caveat that does not include your phones. You can put other things in there, right? Other nuance, instructions, guidelines to the prompt. And so, so sort of like, again, continuing this prompt with some very simple instructions of, write from inside the object. You know, first describe the object, like what do you see, what does it feel, hold it in your hand, and then write from inside it, as if that object is personified, like it has an existence of some kind. And going a step further into what has that object witness, what does it see, what does it know perhaps that you don't know? I always like to give students about a kind of timed writing exercise, because I think in certain cases, not all students have the attention span to write for a very long time. So I like to give various writing, various times, you know, to give them. In this case, it could be anywhere for 10 to 15 minutes or even 5 minutes, kind of light that fire, you know, underneath them. The second category is the body, right? And this is more inspired by poems that are thinking about the body, body poetics, body politics. And this is more of an awareness that starts with the question, where in your body do you keep a story that you haven't told? And write from that place, you know. And sometimes you might begin with a specific body part. It could be an elbow, it could be hands, right? It could be eyes, you know, things like that. And this is more of an invitation to also consider memory or personal memory as a resource, right? As a resource, as a place of inspiration, that you don't always have to look that far, that they hold their own, you know, kind of resource bank of inspiration and information. So what does that mean when we allow the students to let the story arrive through the body and through sensation first? And then third is inheritance. Name one thing you inherited that came without instruction. I think this can be really interesting when we're thinking about culture or tradition, right? That we don't even think that we're doing it, but we're doing it anyways, right? And this does encourage a kind of self-reflection. So describe it and let the details do the work. And I'm aware that I'm coming close to time, so I'm just going to speedy up to the next slide, which is for the teachers, for you, the teacher artist, because before you can invite others, you must also first accept the invitation yourself. And let's see here, let me see. Okay, and here are 3 prompts that I would like to provide to the teaching artists. And again, these can be modified to whichever level relationship you are to you and your artist self. I think the one is incredibly important, which is the permission, right? Which is write down one creative thing that you've always wanted to make and explore or say, but haven't, right? To name it, let it exist on the page. The second is the return also. Think of a moment when language, you know, arrived before you had the words, and write from that moment. And the last is the reclamation, meaning you are not only a teacher writing, you are also a writer. So actually embodying that and feeling its edges. And name 3 things you notice today that you can touch, hear, smell, engage with your 5 senses that carries that memory. And so your observation can become your art. And so I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for being in this room with me as teachers, as writers, and as artists. And I'm happy to share, you know, later on any resources and reading if that's something that folks would like. Thank you.
Yay, maraming salamat, Angela. I'm reminded of the quote from Albert Einstein, the true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination. Maraming salamat. Kuya Markee.
Yes, Tita. Again, maraming salamat, Angela, for sharing your process in creating literary art, and of course for highlighting how curiosity and taking advantage of all our senses aid in our creative writing. Of course, also for sharing the other poets in the Filipino diaspora. I think that's important to highlight those people as well. And hopefully that inspires some of our participants to write their own poems too. All right, so let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is a Filipino poet as well, an essayist, whose work explores in the intersection of text and image and the role of material culture in the construction of cultural identity. In 2020, he was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Awards and the longlist for the Bellivier Book Awards for The Experiment of the Tropics. He's also the winner of the inaugural Gaudy Boy Book Prize. And our next speaker received his MFA from Washington University in St. Louis and from the nonfiction writing program of the University of Iowa. And more recently, he recently joined the faculty at the University of Hawaii English Department. So we have someone joining, another Filipino poet joining the University of Hawaii. Let's all welcome our next speaker, Dr. Larry Ypil.
Hi, everyone. Just want to check if, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me share my screen. Okay. Are you all able to see it?
Yes.
Okay. Or just give me a moment.
Okay, got it. It's nice. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I can't see the room. So give me a moment to pasensya na. Wait, there. You can see it, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Make full screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Correct?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm Larry. I just recently joined the University of Hawaii at Manoa. But as I'll share later on, I've been all over the place. I'm really from Cebu. Sumayong unsa na ba buntag or udto ninyo or hapon na ba? But then I taught in Manila and I did my grad school in the US. So it's really good to be there in this room where I get the sense that I'm in the company of teachers of language and literature, not just in the Philippines, but really across the world. Sorry. I feel like I shared the wrong one, huh? Teaching poetry. Oops. Give me a moment. Sorry, P.
It's okay. Just breathe. We're fine. Maraming from Cebu na bumabati sa'yo. So while we're waiting, if you need access to these slides later on, you can contact me. I'm your point person.
Okay. Today I thought I would share some things from my practice, but also from my experience as a teacher and a writer. My talk today is called Teaching Poetry Through Photography. And I thought today I'd share some of my teaching practices. I thought I would go practical. So I know some of you are teaching creative writing. I know some of you are maybe closet poets. So I thought today I would focus on something that they actually teach in the classroom. I also wanted to share that these are some cultural perspectives that I want to share regarding teaching lit and creative writing. Thought I'd start off with two principles. For me, creative writing is not just a medium of expression, it's a mode of inquiry. What do I mean by that? I feel like we think that poetry is really just hugot, or poetry is really just you feel sadness and then you want to express it. Poetry is definitely that. But in my experience of teaching poetry through the years, I feel like poetry is also a different way of knowing the world. So there are different forms, and there are short stories, there are novels. And poetry is just one way of knowing, our experiences in the world. So it's a mode of inquiry. The second principle I want to emphasize is that one art form can teach us about another. So I know most of us are language teachers, and we're kind of like focused on the word. But in my experience, one thing that I've learned about teaching poetry is I could do it through photography. My practice has been shaped, just a bit of background for me so you know where I'm coming from. My practice has been shaped by moving around. As I mentioned, I was born in Cebu. I did my college in Manila, so I went to Ateneo, and that's where I started really learning how to write. I did my grad school in the States, so I was in St. Louis and then in Iowa. And then for the past 10 years, I've been teaching in Singapore. So just this year, I moved in Hawaii. So like many of you, those who have been moving around, I'm really a diasporic writer, and I'm a Filipino writer, but I'm also a Filipino writer from different spaces. I've taught Philippine Lit and I've taught poetry. So it's been interesting to me how we bring our lesson plans and then it changes wherever we find ourselves in. And in this case, like for the past 10 years, I've been teaching Filipino writing and writing in general in Singapore. So my focus has been mostly through a Southeast Asian lens. So now that I've been in Hawaii, just for the past few months, now I feel like I'm now beginning to sort of like re-examine my work. I also was not originally an English major or a writer or a poet. Like many Filipinos, I obeyed my parents and they wanted me to become a doctor. So I'm actually a bio major and I went to med school in UP Med. And to the surprise, but also like, as you can tell, disappointment to my parents, at some point I said I wanted to be a writer. So I left medical school and I started teaching writing and literature in Manila. And that's how the story went. I bring these three books up because I think just to give you a sense that as one is moving around, one's work as a poet also changes. So my first book was published in Ateneo, really written about Cebu, but also written in Manila. So I've always felt that the Philippines was always a set of different stopping points from which we write. So while we come from a certain place, life takes us elsewhere and we bring our words with us, but we're also writing about the places that we're from. So mahalaga yun sa akin, very important na kung we write from the places we came from, and maybe we also write towards the places that we move towards. The one in the middle is Experiment of the Tropics, where I write about photographs. So a lot of this lecture today is really coming from my own practice also. This was published in New York through Gaudy Boy Press. And as you can tell from the cover, it's really a version of the Philippines that's been saksak sinagol, that's been sort of like flipped and rolled around. The third is a set of short, small magazines that I've done with designers, Filipino also, but also based around the world. So one of them is based in Melbourne, another is based in Cebu. And I found it really fulfilling to work with visual artists wherever I am in. So my recent work has been with designers coming from Cebu. I have, for some reason, found good friends in tattoo artists. And they've been my kind of like collaborators in my work. Okay, I want to jump to the focus on poetry and photography. And I want to maybe emphasize the one I've italicized at the bottom. Poetry is not just as a way of saying, but a way of seeing. We like to think that poetry has to do just with flowery language. We like to think that poetry has to do with just kind of like playing around with words. It's definitely that. But poetry, I think, really is about like what we choose to look at and how we choose to look at them. So it's really the art of attention. How do we find poetry? We find it by looking at where we are and looking at it in a poetic way. Right. So I think part of the way we teach poetry is not just teaching students how to kind of play around with words. I think we're also teaching them about how to find the poetry in their world. Right? Because if you can't find the poetry in your world, then you have nothing to write about. And I feel like at the start, we really just need to teach them how to look. I know many of you are familiar with the haiku, walang kamatayang haiku. Whether you're teaching in the Philippines or in the States, many of you and your students know this. So when I ask students, it's always 575, sir. 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. As you know, it's a poetic form that comes from Japan. So the tradition of nature poetry about the seasons, and this was usually written by monks and courtly women. So maybe just some samples. These are haiku written by Japanese poets. The first two are written by Basho. The second is the third and the fourth are written by Isa. Basho, I'll just read the samples. Climb Mount Fuji, O snail, but slowly, slowly. So as you can tell, it doesn't really follow the 575 rule anymore. So a lot of contemporary haiku are kind of like simplified. So 3 lines lang, but it's really still focused on an image. Another haiku, even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo's cry, I long for Kyoto. So as you can tell, Basho is very dramatic. Even if he is in Kyoto, he is longing for Kyoto. Even in Hawaii, I am longing for Hawaii. Even in Manila, I am longing for Manila. There's a longing for a place, even if you're in that place. Isa, I'll give you samples. Mosquito at my ear, does it think I'm deaf? And then another haiku. Even with insects, some can sing, some can't. So ayun, you can tell that Isa is a bit more funny. He's writing about insects. He's probably like having a hard time sleeping and he's irritated by the mosquito. And even with some insects, some can sing, some can't. So I thought I'd share these two because they share the range of haiku, where it's an attention to the environment, but also a kind of like deep humor. As you can tell, the really good haiku, there's usually a turn or a twist. And that's what you call poetic tension. So it can be imagistic tension or a thematic tension. So maybe just, something like that. When you just with the example of Kyoto, right? Even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoos cry along for Kyoto. That's a thematic or an emotional tension. You are already in the place, and for some reason, you still long for the place. Whereas climb Mount Fuji, oh snail, but slowly, slowly, that's kind of like an imagistic tension. We know snails already move slowly, but then why is this poet telling the snail to move even slowly, right? And it's almost like giving instructions that you need to move slowly in order to see the world. So I'm bringing this, when I talk to students, I bring this notion of tension and this turn or twist, because I start, giving them an exercise. So if you're, I don't know, if you're waking up or it's already evening there, I want you to maybe like take out a piece of paper or on your phone. If you want to try it out, this is a little exercise I give students. So I'll be showing photos and, just look at the photo and try to identify the visual tension. This can be something that catches your attention, the drama or conflict or vibe that you think can be the focus of a haiku. And maybe if you have the energy or interest, try writing a haiku. So just trace 575, where the first line is short, the second line is maybe longer, and the third line is also short. So are we ready?
Yes, ready.
Great. So
Game
pick up your
na.
pens and I'll show you photos. And I invite you to just look, no? And just like what catches your eye? What is the drama? So no pressure to write yet, just, for this lecture, just look. If you were to write a haiku, what would you write about? This is the second photo. What catches your eye? Where might the tension be? And this is the third photo. If you were to write a haiku, what would it be? So in the classroom, I obviously give more time, but not enough time, not too much time. I give them 1 minute, 2 minutes, so that students actually don't have too much time to think. The virtue of the haiku is the instant effect. Maybe one more photo, this one. And I thought I'd share some haiku of some students of my former classes. I'll go back to the haiku. And these are two samples. One-legged jump. I see a wall behind what's not there. She is fully there. So I think this student was looking at the fact that she had only one leg, right? And behind the missing leg was a wall. One-legged jump. I see a wall behind what's not there. She is fully there. Another student wrote, jump rope, hold your breath, see me win. Samples. 3 girls, barefoot on the wooden floor, summer childhood. Another sample. The light cuts across the refrigerator into the afternoon. We melt in memory. So if you notice, the ones who wrote this haiku was looking at the light that was in the photo. The first one was looking at the feet of the girls and was thinking about, summer childhood and the wooden floor. If you notice, the haiku is most powerful when it focuses on images. So you really have only 3 lines, right? So the challenge is to look at one particular line and then just see what happens there, and you shape the poem out of that. Maybe one more sample with the 4th photo. Shadow of my shadow on a net. I look away from you. Shadow of my shadow on a net. I look away from you. So notice with this haiku, it begins with the element of the shadow and the shadow of the net, right? Which is beneath the boy that's lying down. And then the last line is, I look away from you. And I'm wondering, like on one hand, that could be the boy looking away from us. So it's, I look away from you. But it could also be us, looking at the boy and then looking away at this photo perhaps. So yeah, it's a very simple poem, shadow of my shadow on a net. I look away from you. And it's really just capturing that moment. It's capturing the photo, but it's also capturing our looking at the photo. So even if the haiku is just 3 lines, notice that it can be very complex. And it's able to capture a lot of different aspects of looking. And then
Larry, excuse me.
Yep.
Some of our participants wrote, Marvin Tejada wrote, images in black and white, color fades, a memory of past lives, handicapped, I cannot skip today. And Love Batoon says, sa pagitan ng liwanag at katahimikan, anino'y humihinga.
Ay, ang ganda.
Just some of the
Yes.
samples.
Ang Pinoy talaga magaling magsulat. It's what I have noticed across the world. No, thank you for sharing. And if some of you wrote more haiku, just share it in the chat box so we can fill our chats with poetry today. One last sharing. So after I let my students do the kind of photo here, I asked them to write a haiku for each. So I share with them some of the photos that I gathered in Cebu. So when I was home a few years ago, I went to the University of San Carlos. I know most of you are familiar with that university in Cebu. So they have a Cebuano Studies Center. So if you've done research on Cebuano Lit, you would have stayed there and talked to Linda Alburo or Risil Mojares. And so I visited there once, and they actually have a very small but beautiful photo collection. So these are black and white photos of old Cebu in the early 20th century. And these were actually the photos that I would eventually write for my book. But I bring, digital copies of these photos with me when I teach, because I invite my students to write about the photos too. So I'll just share the instructions, so you might want to try out in your own classrooms. So write a haiku for each of the black and white archival photographs. And these are photos taken from the American period in the Philippines. So you can use whatever themes we've discussed in class to shape this haiku, but you can also, more importantly, use your critical and playful eye to write haiku that speak your own stories via these photos. After writing a haiku for each photo, weave them together to form your own version of a haiku sequence. So let me explain a bit, because there are parts of this instruction that might be unclear. So it's really fun and also really stressful, because I kind of like show these photos and just give them a minute for each photo, and it's one after the other. So para siyang contest marathon, haiku marathon, that you can play around with your class. And then I tell them, that, because some of them don't know Philippine history. So it's been interesting to me, because I've tried this exercise in different countries. And some of them are really hesitant, right? Like, for example, some of my Singaporean students felt like because they didn't know the Philippines, they felt they did not have the right to talk about the Philippine photographs. This year, this is the first time I'm teaching it to a lot of Filipino Americans. So there's also varying levels. Some of them feel also like they don't really know Philippine history. So, what can they see? And I try to tell them, and this is the power of creative writing. You don't need to know a lot. You just need to look. Right? And they can do research after your haiku class, and and you can test them about Cebuano history or whatever. But when they're encountering the photo, you're inviting the student to just look and to notice maybe things that were not very clear at the start. And you're inviting them to write. And sometimes what they write doesn't really have anything to do with the photograph, but maybe they reveal themselves in the process of writing about the photo. So, if you notice, like, even as they're writing about Philippine photographs, they are also like writing about their own Filipino sensibilities. And I say, like, it's just 3 lines. The stakes are super low. So even the ones that are afraid of poetry can certainly give this a try. I emphasize this because I think creative writing, like I said, can look at photographs and can look at history in a way maybe that is very different from the usual history class. Because in history class, we're all obsessed with like, what's the name of this guy? So I'll show, so maybe for the next 1 minute or two, I invite you to just look at these old photos of Cebu. And if some of you still have energy or are inspired, maybe you can think about a haiku. So yeah, let's look at them first. And then, yeah. So this was the old railroad in Cebu, which was bombed during World War II. So there's no more train station in Cebu. That's why it's very traffic now in Cebu. So this is American period, early 20th century. I call it the golden age of the white suit, where men really just wore white suits and hats. Everyone was well dressed in this period, I feel. A very Pinoy scene, no? All the white priests on the second floor, and then the Pinoys with the guitarra on the lower floor. Typical Pinoy scene with the churches as kind of centers, not just of religion, but of culture. This is my favorite photo among those I discovered there. I'm very obsessed with, sorry, my pointer can't really point it out right now, but I'm super obsessed with, look at the flower that's very near the right ear of the guy. And you know, like when I write a haiku, I always feel like I want to write about the distance between the petal and the ear of the man. More photos. Also another beautiful one of these four women. So if some catch your eye, like I said, feel free to write a haiku. I'll keep showing maybe just a handful more photos. Oh, this is Vicente Gullias, for some of you familiar with Cebu. It's a Gullias owns a school there. And then in the Cebu Pier, the women, having sacks on their head. So yeah, it's maybe a number of things I want to emphasize before I end. This practice is called docu-poetics or archival Philippine poetics. So use this as a term in your classrooms if you want to try this out. As you can tell, docu as in documentary, but then poetics in the sense that you're using poetry to look at historical documents. It's poetry about archival photographs, and photographs are used as sites of rumination, imagination, speculation, over and above there being historical documents. It's a chance to engage students not just with poetry, but history. So if you teach both, it's a nice space to mix both. It's a good way to talk about the past, but also to encourage students to really play with the past. I think we are sometimes too obsessed with, I feel like we're wearing our museum gloves and the past is like, this very precious thing. But poetry, I think, invites us to play with memory and historical events. So Philippine poetics as method and innovation, that's my last point there. I've always felt, and I want to kind of like look at what I'm sharing at too. I know this is meant to be a forum on Philippine poetry, but I also wanted to emphasize that, we live in a world where there's really a lot of cultural mixing. So when I'm bringing in the haiku, I know it's a Japanese form, but I think, like taking that form really allows us to look at Philippine history and Philippine photography in a different way. And I want to emphasize that it's that mode of mixing, it's that mode of innovating that I would like to think makes Philippine art really special. And I would like to think that is also what makes us really authentic Filipinos. It's not just that we know our country or our heritage, but we have this magical way of mixing things. And I think that's a really huge part of Philippine poetry and Philippine art. And we have an aesthetic of mixing. And I think for those of the teachers that are teaching in the diaspora, like what does it mean to situate Philippine culture and art in the midst of the many different things that we come into contact with. And for those of us who are teaching in the Philippines, like to remember that the Philippines is a very mixed place. And there are many regions and many cultures and many languages. There's not just one. And I'm hoping like an exercise like this can maybe inspire some of you um, to look for photographs from your local towns. If your town does not have a museum, visit the houses of the oldest people in the town, and see if you can take digital copies of their photographs. And maybe your class can begin to collect all those old photographs from your towns, and maybe you can even like start a little museum of photography. I feel I'm already reaching outside of the topic today. I know I was just asked to teach poetry, but as you can tell, like, it's about collecting history, it's collecting documents. And as teachers, I think our tasks go beyond the lesson plans that we teach on writing and literature. It's really valuing culture and history. And if a chance like this can make your students aware of their past, then it's worth giving a shot. Yeah, if you wish to reach out, I'm always interested to know if you try this out in your classrooms, if it works, or if it doesn't work, kung palpak, tell me how it can be improved. So yeah, those are my contacts. I'm on Instagram also if you want to reach out there. I think there's time to have questions later on. But thank you very much for listening. I hope this lesson plan has been or will be useful for you. Daghang salamat.
Maraming salamat po, Sir Larry. Again, for our participants, let's give Sir Larry isang bagsak. One more, isang bagsak. All right, thank you so much again for sharing your expertise and of course definitely invoking our creativity in writing through photographs, and as you mentioned earlier, we can use our poetry to delve more on our culture and our history. So let's go ahead and move on now to our next speaker. So then we can go into our Q&A. Our chat room is very, very lively. So I know for sure our Q&A is going to be very interesting later on. But let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is now, I guess, the Suki of UH Filipino program and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. So our next speaker, we have previously worked together in a few projects, including 3 seasons of Mga Kwentong Pagkain, Pinoy Food Stories. That's another thing that you guys can look into. We can drop our website here. That's another project that we have worked with both CSEAS and also the Center for Philippine Studies. But anyway, our speaker has been a Filipino language and literature teacher at the Ateneo de Manila Junior High School, and he has been involved in translating and recording for Sandaang Salaysay, a podcast series featuring Filipino legends and other heritage texts. He is a consultant and writer for the Mamacita Foundation and enjoys testing his research in the kitchen with his family. A proponent of student empowerment, he seeks to promote critical and student-centered learning inside the classroom. His awards, our next speaker is multi-awarded for sure, and this includes the Eagle Fund Award for Excellence in Teaching at Ateneo de Manila High School, among others. Tita Pia?
And of course, being our true Suki, a few years ago, he was a visiting lecturer at the UH Department of Indo-Pacific Languages and Literatures. He has also produced his translation, Nole Metangere Edition Pang High School, a wonderful resource for teachers, which includes beautiful sketches by Nikki Calma. Let's all welcome soon to be Dr. Paolo Venbi Paculan, fondly called Sir Pao.
Hi. Yeah. So I know the chat box is active. I want to know if I'm heard. Is it too loud, too soft?
Okay
You
lang
want
po,
more
Sir Pao.
volume? More volume po ba? Ayan.
Konti
Okay.
lang.
Okay. So yun,
Thank
I wasn't
you.
planning on doing this, but I wanted to make sure that everyone's still here. So are they allowed to unmute just for a second?
Yes po.
Okay, sige. So let's do this. Since I'm a basic ed teacher, I want to make sure you're still there. And so this is how we greet each other, my students and I. So I say, "Kumusta?" with a wave. And then they say, sir, not sir, not sir, sir, with waves also. Okay? So let's see if you got that because my students get it in one try. Okay? So let's see how many tries you need. 1, 2, 3. Get ready to unmute. Kumusta?
Sir!
All right. Okay, so thank you very much. Makes me feel very welcome. So, um, yeah, so thank you, Dr. Pia Arboleda. I'd like to share my screen first so that I can continue without a hitch. All right. So thank you, Doc Pia Arboleda, and to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and MSU Gensan for this invitation to converse with all of you. You are esteemed companions in this mission of teaching Filipino literature, culture, and language. Magandang tanghali po, Ma'am Helen Grace Quisia of the Consulate of Guam. And aloha to those I had met when I was there 2 years ago, such as Dr. Zubiri, Ate Amy, and to those I had previously worked with, like Markee. Hi. It is an honor to speak with you about one of my favorite topics, Jose Rizal's first novel. So my goal is to allow us to get in touch with the real Noli Me Tangere. Yes, you heard us right, Doc Pia and I. That's Noli Me Tangere. I'm quite ashamed, actually, that after spending 11 years translating the Noli for my high school students, I did not know how to pronounce the title correctly, or at least the way Rizal heard it in his mind. I first heard this pronunciation while listening to podcasts discussing Rizal. The two separate guests who knew Spanish pronounced the title Noli Me Tangere. And because I also had to learn Spanish to check my Rizal translations, I realized my mistake. Oo nga. Why was I reading the G like the title was written in Spanish when I had known all along that the title was written in Latin? Oh, yes, and not just Latin, ecclesiastical Latin, which Rizal studied in school and which he heard in the Catholic Mass in at least every Sunday. So, in that language, a G preceding an E is pronounced J, as in Regem Angelorum, a line from a Christmas carol I had been singing as a choir boy since grade school. So, since this is a quote from the Bible, Rizal said the title is from the Gospel of Luke, but it's actually from John chapter 20, verse 17. Let's have Google Translate pronounce it for us. I know Google Translate is not my friend, Kuya Raju, but in this case, it can help. I checked it. So here, try to shift to that tab. All right. So can you see it? Can you see the Google Translate?
Yes.
All right. So let's see if you can hear it. No? No?
One more time, share sound po.
Share sound. Okay. So unshare lang po muna ako, ha?
Yes po.
Okay. Try natin. Ay, naka-share sound po. Baka ayaw ni Google Translate lang na magano. Okay. So let's try it again. Anyway, so since we are having technical difficulties, it was working really fine just a few hours ago. So yeah, let's go back to our presentation. So it would have said noli me tangere, which is what I want you to say now. So if it's okay, can some of you unmute and say noli me tangere, noli me tangere. 1, 2, 3, go.
Noli me tangere. Noli me tangere.
Yan po ang tama kasi ito po ay nasa Latin. Okay, so from this rather lengthy discussion of just the title, we might get a glimpse of the objectives for this talk, which are to approach the Noli that Rizal actually wrote, and through this, to explore nuanced insights for our students today. This will also allow us to respond to some findings from a study by Aguilar and company in 2021 entitled Learning Without Reading. And that pretty much sums it up. Because of a lack of textbooks, students resort to summaries on the internet, which they themselves doubt the correctness of. Only 10% of students have actually read any version in its entirety, even the summaries, and not even one had read any unabridged version. So these are grade 9 and 10 students in the study. Because of this, teachers resort to teaching the Noli orally. Kinikwento na lang. And where do we, maybe we've experienced this too. And where do they get this information? From their own teachers who passed it orally to them. So the Noli has become an oral tradition, subject to all the dynamics and pitfalls of such. Because of this, students think the Noli is merely an expose of Spaniards, of the abuses of Spaniards during the time of Rizal. They think Crisostomo Ibarra is the equivalent of Rizal, both heroes who have the same love life, the same beliefs, and operated in the same way. They think that Sisa is simply the symbol of a good mother, so good that she lost her mind when she lost them. But to put it bluntly, these interpretations are wrong, or at least need a little bit more nuance, as those who have really read the novel will attest. There are a lot more misconceptions, but let's focus on these three. Let's take them one by one and see if, by any chance, correcting these could give students fresh insights about their world today. So was the Noli merely ready? Ready? Okay. So was the Noli really just an expose of abuses by the Spaniards? And is the lesson here merely to be aware of oppression and to fight against oppressors? Are these the story and the message that Rizal really intended? Well, if we look at Rizal's dedication, which is seldom given its own lesson, we see right away from the third paragraph that Rizal says to his patria, the land of his birth, I will sacrifice, I will sacrifice to the truth everything, even my own self-respect. For as your son, I also suffer in your defects and failings. Your defects and failings. Was he talking lovingly to Spain as her son? A son who missed her while he was in Europe, as he said in the earlier paragraphs? Or was he talking about the failings of the Philippines itself? Yes, we see friar abuses. Even with the death of Crispin, which Basilio dreamed about, we see this passage. Trigger warning. Okay. In desperation, his little brother rose. Mad with pain, he threw himself upon his tormentor and bit him on the hand. The curate gave a cry and dropped the rattan. The sacristan, note, the sacristan caught up a heavy cane and struck the boy a blow on the head, so that he fell stunned. The curate, seeing him down, trampled him with his feet. But the child no longer defended himself, nor did he cry out. He rolled along the floor, a lifeless mass that left a damp track. So, though we can say that it was under Salvi's watch that Crispin was killed, yes, it's Salvi, because the stress is on the I. That's how Rizal wrote it. Under Salvi's watch, the Crispin was killed. But it was the Indio Sacristan Mayor who dealt the killing blow. We also see that at least two Spaniards were on the side of the Filipinos. The first is Teniente Guevara, who treated Don Rafael Ibarra, Crisostomo's father, as a dear friend. The second pro-Filipino Spaniard was the highest official himself, the Capitan General, who, in the chapter about him, said the following: we, the ruling government, are not wanting in goodwill, but we are obliged, hindi kami kulang sa mabuting pagkagusto para sa inyo, but we are obliged to make use of outside eyes and arms, which, instead of serving the country, might be serving only their own interests. But take note, this is not our fault. It is due to circumstances. It is the fault of circumstances, or we could say a fault of the system. What ails the Philippines is not a parasite that can be purged from the body. Rizal calls it a cancer, which is the real source of the novel's title. So an article from Xiao Chua pointed to a very old book, a list, as Rizal says in his introduction, of humanity's ills. In it is found a cancer, we note here, of the eyelids, nose, great angle of the eye, and its neighboring parts, commonly called the noli me tangere. Right? So this is from the 1700s. Deemed incurable by both ancients and moderns. Deemed incurable, and therefore allowed to spread throughout the bodily system. A systemic disease that eye doctors, as Rizal was training to be, would rather not touch, since touching it only caused pain and not cure. This then might be the real insight. We look for villains and bad guys, and there are oppressors and oppressive acts. But to cure society's ills, we must look at systems that we must change. We must not view wars, for example, only as battles between races, but as byproducts of gigantic messy mechanisms or ecosystems we ourselves are part of. For students, Rizal's message is to look at the bigger picture and see how that bigger picture includes you. All right. Question number 2. Was Ibarra Rizal? Ayan. A simple Google search, filtered by my algorithm, of course, yields the following results. So, show me a picture of Ibarra. There you go. This, and even this. Right. So, I mean, even we who have actually studied the Noli, if asked to imagine Ibarra, would be hard-pressed to erase Rizal's countenance in our minds. But is the hero we must emulate really Ibarra, seen as lover boy and quiet reformer choosing the gradual path of education, as we teachers have? Yet we see from this excerpt from chapter 2 that Ibarra is described as being tall, well-built, and as a Spanish mestizo. And we know that Rizal was neither tall nor did he have Spanish blood. Tama po ba, Doc Pia? And contrary
Yes
to the...
po. Hindi siya matangkad.
At saka hindi po siya, ang tawag dyan, Kastila. Okay,
Oo.
and contrary to the view that he was pacifist and reformer like Rizal, Ibarra actually attacked Padre Salvi in chapter 13 by weighing down on his shoulders until he was on the ground, and he almost killed Padre Damaso in chapter 34 with a kitchen knife. Okay. And he placed his foot on the neck of the friar. Okay, so he was a violent man. And one of the things he was last heard saying in the novel is this: now, I see the horrible cancer that gnaws at the society, which grips its flesh and which demands violent eradication. They have compelled me to become a criminal, and so I will become a subversive, but a true dissident. Magiging filibustero ako, pero tunay na filibustero. Tan, 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 sequel. And in the end, Ibarra's violent nature prevailed. He was swallowed by the dark side. So who was the real hero in Rizal's mind? The one whose thoughts were closest to his. In that same chapter where Ibarra had just escaped from Fort Santiago and was escaping towards Laguna de Bay, this exchange happened. Santa Ana, murmured one of them. Would you know this house? They were passing by the Jesuits' country house. Ah, there I spent many happy and cheerful days, sighed the other. Familiar? Well, it should be, because Rizal himself, on his way to Bagumbayan for execution, passed by the Jesuit school and said to his priest companion, "Is that the Ateneo? I spent many happy years there." But who said these words in the Noli? It was not Ibarra, but Elias. Take note, Rizal put a stress mark on the top of the I, meaning in Rizal's mind's ear, he was hearing Elias and not Elias, as we commonly say it. Elias, who could disperse a mob. So maybe he might be closest to Rizal. Elias, who could disperse a mob that would have attacked the Spaniards. In chapter 40. Elias, who in chapter 45 prevented the revolutionaries from shedding blood until all peaceful means were exhausted. Elias, who in the untitled chapter 54 could have killed Crisostomo upon learning that Crisostomo's family was the perpetrator of the system that he wanted to bring down, but chose to help Ibarra instead. But here is where Elias' core as a character is revealed. After breaking him out of prison, Elias advises Ibarra to leave the country. Ibarra asks Elias to join him. And here is Elias' response. Impossible. It's true that I cannot love or be happy in my country, but I can suffer and die in it, and perhaps for it. That is always something. May the misfortunes of my native land be my own misfortunes, and although no noble sentiment unites us, although our hearts do not beat to a single name, at least may the common calamity bind me to my countrymen. At least may I weep over our sorrows with them. May the same hard fate oppress all our hearts alike. So maybe Rizal's choice of true hero and closest alter ego shows us this. We must solve society's ills, and it will take time to address, but maybe the cure begins with this: compassion, solidarity with the suffering, valuing even those we might see as enemies. Last question for today. Was CSEAS just a symbol of a good mother who lost her mind when she lost her sons? For the great majority of people, this is CSEAS. I hope you can hear it, but if not, well, you've heard it before.
Ako, baliw! Baliw! Nakikita niyo bang mga lumilipan na pera at pagkain? Akin lang to! Akin lang! Akin lang to! Akin lang mga anak ko!
Oh, okay, so you know that, So it's the famous CSEAS monologue, which actually didn't come from the Noli Me Tangere. But that's who she is to a great multitude of Filipinos and maybe even those in other countries. A crazy mother looking for her sons. But was this really Rizal's depiction? And is the lesson for students merely to appreciate their mothers, as the students in the study said, or be good parents one day? Certainly, she shouted their names while looking for them, as we see here. But when she returned home and saw a blood-stained shred of Basilio's shirt, she seized and examined it in the sunlight. There were bloodstains on it, but CSEAS hardly saw them. Okay? So, was she looking for Basilio? She hardly saw the bloodstains. Next. And that chapter ends with this oft-forgotten bit of poetry. Sir, poetry. Perhaps such such suffering was too great for weak human endurance, and Providence had intervened with its sweet remedy, forgetfulness. However that may be, the next day CSEAS wandered about, smiling, singing, and talking with all the creatures of wood and field. In the end, CSEAS said their names no more, and in fact did not even recognize Basilio when Basilio was calling and chasing after her in chapter 63. But what suffering had caused Providence to give her the gift of forgetfulness? A clue might be found in Rizal's depiction of the walk of shame CSEAS had to endure when she was arrested by the Guardia Civil as bait for her son Crispin. Nick Joaquin relates that the same thing had to be endured by Rizal's mother. Could she be the one referred to by the chapter title? Anyway, here's the possible clue. She had felt misery and knew what it was to be abandoned by everyone, even her own husband. But until now, she had considered herself honored and respected. Up to this time, she had looked with compassion on those boldly dressed women whom the town knew as the concubines of the soldiers. Now it seemed to her that she had fallen even a step lower than they in the social scale. So she felt herself honored and respected. So because of that, she wanted to avoid the people's stares, but she just had to pass the church of San Diego right when the people were streaming out after Mass. And who should she hear but a soldier's concubine shouting, "Where did you catch her? And the money?" CSEAS felt as if she had received a slap in the face, for that woman had exposed her before the crowd. Sa Tagalog po, hinubaran siya sa harap ng mga tao. She raised her eyes for a moment to get her fill of scorn and hate. Tiningnan niya yung mga tao, but saw the people far, far away. So, this is when she became crazy. Certainly, Crispin's disappearance had something to do with it. Certainly, she suffered much at the hands of her abusive husband. But I propose that she began to lose her mind when she lost the last thing she could hold on to as a martyr, her dignity. So was she just representing loving mothers or some other group too? The answer might once again lie in a part which is easily abridged out or excluded from summaries. 5 paragraphs worth of introduction before CSEAS was even mentioned in the chapter bearing her name, which by the way is the nickname of Rizal's sister, Narcisa. Allow me to read some lines from the paragraphs describing the evening after All Saints' Day, when Catholics pray for their beloved dead. Through the dark night, the villagers slept. The families who had remembered their dead gave themselves up to quiet and satisfied sleep. So these are the rich people. For they had recited their requiems, the novenas of the souls, and had burned many wax tapers, which they had to pay for, before the sacred images. But the poor sleep not so tranquilly. The poor are sad and thoughtful, for on that night, if they have not recited many prayers, yet they have prayed much. They pray in the language of their misery. Their souls weep for them and for those dead beings whose love was their wealth. Wilt thou be satisfied, O you who blessed poverty, with the simple prayers of the poor, offered before a rude picture in the light of a dim wick? And you, religion preached for suffering humanity, have you forgotten your mission of consoling the oppressed in their misery, and of humiliating the powerful in their pride? Have you now promises only for the rich, for those who can pay? Wow. So there's another paragraph, another long paragraph, then another semi-long paragraph, and then it ends with this. The dogs howl mournfully in the streets, and superstitious folk, hearing them, are convinced that they see spirits and ghosts. But neither the dogs nor the other animals see the sorrows of men. Yet how many of these exist? And only then was CSEA's life introduced as her house being distant an hour's walk from San Diego. So here we see that CSEA is representative not only of mothers, but of the people described in these paragraphs, which introduce her chapter. The poor and marginalized, whose sufferings have made them lose even their dignity. And so the lesson for our students might be this. If you want to treat society's ills, treat the most affected parts first. Because of the Q&A earlier, I was inspired to skip my planned conclusion and end my presentation by speaking more personally. So a hot issue in the Philippines today is the proposed reduction of units in the Gen Ed curriculum. Some of those who proposed it are my friends, so I'm positive that they mean well and that they're consulting the people. But as of now, Filipino was removed as a separate subject. I'll repeat that for those who don't know the situation. Filipino was removed as a separate subject. So were philosophy and literature. But Rizal remained on the list because it is required by law, the 1950s Rizal law. So that's why it's important to be experts in the Noli. Because while we have that space, we can teach good literature. We can teach critical thinking. We can encourage nuanced views about the world's problems and ways to solve these. So, I'd like to implore you and encourage you to read the Noli again. I encourage you to look for a better version, a complete one. And let's have the students read it. In the Philippines, yes. But let's also make it a part of the canon of world literature. You might have heard a lot of criticism about Rizal in the Noli. Well, that's the problem with being famous, right? That Rizal was elitist, that he was Tagalog-centric, that the Noli isn't even well written. But what I know is that just this school year, when our grade 8 students read the Noli's ending in class, some of them were crying until the next period. And if this novel can make young people cry for their country and their kapwa-tao, then maybe it's a novel worth getting closely in touch with. So once again, thank you for this opportunity. There are so many more forgotten passages we can talk about, so please don't hesitate to contact me at this email. I've also included a QR code to all the sources for this talk. So, mahalo at mabuhay po tayong lahat.
Nakakaiyak. Markee.
Maraming salamat, Sir Pao. I don't know what to say. Like that was like I think that was a perfect ending for all the three speakers that we had for the second round. And I think we're even ready to go into our open forum now because sobrang active ng ating chat room. So we do invite all our panelists to turn on their videos again. I think we're waiting for just one more. Perfect. All right. So we do have all our panelists now, and we have a lot of questions here. But I know people are already waiting for Angela to answer some of the questions. She did say they did say that they are answering the questions during this Q&A. So let's get started. I guess there's this first question from Susana Layug about how does your Filipino heritage or ancestry affect your craft or artistry?
Hi, Susanna. Thank you so much again for that question. What a really powerful question. I would say that my Filipino heritage and ancestry greatly and immensely affect my craft and artistry and also my aesthetic when it comes to poetics and literature. And I would say how it specifically, affects that artistry is that when I feel and experience myself as a Filipino and as a Filipino American, I cannot not also have that identity and that position also in conversation and in question with my other identities, like Filipino American, and also educator, and also artist, and also feminist, and also, a queer person, or or whatever, rebel rouser. Not that I use that, but we'll just say a little bit. Sure, why not? And so, like, I think I like to really include like all my messy selves into that, Filipino um, ancestry and heritage, even the ones that are severed, even the ones that have been, disconnected because of diaspora, right? I think all of that becomes part of heritage and ancestry, and also the possibility for reimagining, what has been lost or what has been severed. Um, and just to give some examples, and then I can move to the next question. One of the poems that I've written about in my book, Nature Felt But Never Apprehended, I wrote a poem that was informed and inspired by a Filipino film, Markova Comfort Gay, and which was part of the lineage of Filipino neorealist films during a particular time. And that, film moved me so much to kind of see, a painful time in Filipino history, and violence against Filipino women, specifically, comfort women. But in this film, like having to see like another body or experience, as part of that narrative, like really informed me, and I had to write a poem about that. Also, uh, I am definitely one of those folks that have had a difficult and very fraught relationship with the Filipino language. I was born in Iloilo City in Panay, and I have family there, and immigrated when I was around 6, 7 years old in the mid 80s. And so, like, it's always been a really, difficult experience reconnecting with my language. However, in one of the poems that was also published in that book, but also in an anthology, I wrote this poem called Albuleria, and I really wanted to connect to what my reimagined sort of like Babaylan ancestor, right? And there was a translation component where, even though I'm not a Filipino language scholar, or nor am I fluent in Hiligay non Ilonggo, it gave me this opportunity to connect with my mother and to connect with my mother's friends, to kind of translate this really dense poem. And they also were able to, it gave them an opportunity to engage in my work, even though they don't read poetry all the time. And so it was a really illuminating experience for me, in which started off as really, insecure and uncomfortable, became this connection between my mother and her friends, and became like this intergenerational collaboration. So, anyways, thanks for that question again, Susanna.
Thanks, Angela. We do have a question here for Sir Pao. Sir Pao from Alican, Pandapatan. Ang ganda ng pagtalakay sa akda ni Rizal habang mahaba babasahin ang nobela at hindi tiyak na matatapos ito sa isang quarter. Dapat po ba itong ipakilala sa unang quarter pa lamang para mayroon silang sapat na panahon para mabasa ito?
Salamat po para sa tanong. So thank you for that question. We have been trying multifaceted solution to the problem of the students not reading the Noli. So the first thing we did was we made our own version of Noli, which is in a language that is more attuned to the language of the students. So that's the first, and there are a lot of pictures and there are a lot of definitions in there. So it's really designed for the students. So that's the first most important step, I think. And then second is we chose chapters that they would read in full, and which chapters they would read only as buod, only as summaries. So, but how do we make sure? So this is the third thing. How do we make sure that they read it? Actually, we don't give quizzes. We just check their annotations. So their annotations have to be really, really, they have to be a lot. So they have to underline, they have to comment on certain places, they have to put stars on the parts that they have that have struck them. So that's the third thing. So even in the assessment part, so we did that. And then another thing that we did is the most important chapters, we have audiobook versions of them. So we also produced audiobook versions of them. So they get to hear, it comes alive a bit more when you hear the audiobook. So, but mainly, I think what the most important thing is the teachers really love it. The teachers really love the Noli. The teachers, in the end, after trying a lot of different discussion techniques, we had a discussion where we said that, the best gimmick is actually just to read it, just to read the lines, because that's the gimmick, because it's so iconoclastic, it's so deep, it's so funny, it's so bastos even at times, that you don't need a separate gimmick. You just need to get them in touch with the text. So, but that only happens if you yourself are in touch with the text in a very deep way. So we always have discussion groups. So there are times when we're almost crying while discussing the Noli. There are times when we're amazed at certain details that we don't even teach the students. So I think that's really the core of it. And also having all these different interventions that will encourage the students. So I guess it works because they were crying by the end of it. So yeah. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Sir Pao. And then we do have another question here from Jasmine Nobleza. It's for Angela, but I think Sir Larry can also give his input on this one. Jasmine is saying that they are a junior high school teacher and their students and them truly enjoy discussing literature and writing short stories that they share in class. What she wanted to ask is, for y'all's advice on how they can effectively encourage young writers to use specificity and sensory details in their creative writing while still giving them the freedom to express their imagination and cultural experiences.
Larry, did you want to answer that first, or did you want me to go ahead?
No, go for it, Angela.
Okay.
I can add after it.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for that question, Jasmine. That's a really great question. So, and I think it's really great because, you're thinking about how do I like balance or tether, these craft elements, but also this part of writing or creative writing that also wants this freedom of expression, right? And imagination and the exercise of that. And I feel, for me, what has been effective, right, is to really have a sort of diverse, array of various writing exercises. One, maybe some that are much more specific, that might have a little bit more like instruction or guidelines attached to them of what you're trying to like fulfill in your curriculum or in that particular standard, whether it's imagery or landscape or setting or building that tension. But then you also have to have that other part that that fosters that liberatory sense where the imagination can go wild and also uncensored. And so like there are moments where I do have students do automatic writing where they kind of just write and they have a choice whether to share it or not share it, because then it gives them more openness and more spaciousness to kind of let go. And there are also moments where I want to engage in automatic writing. And when I say automatic writing, whether it's on a digital format or maybe they're using a pen and paper where they're kind of just writing and letting and kind of like a stream of consciousness, for lack of a better word, kind of just kind of go. And there are moments I will actually choose a really moving line to me or a line from a poem that I feel has potential, and that becomes the prompt, that becomes the gateway or the jumping off point into automatic writing. So I'm kind of really juggling like high and low um, writing exercises, if that makes any sense.
Maybe just to add to that, I think that's why I start with photographs, because it forces students to really look at the concrete, right? I think part of the pressure of poetry is that students feel it has to be deep, it has to be grand, it has to be hugot, right? When in fact, I've always felt the opposite. Sometimes it's better to start with images and then you discover the feeling rather than start with the feeling and then you discover the images. Of course, it goes both ways, right? But trust the image because it will move to the point. There's a question on the chat from Alikan Pandapatan.
Yeah, while moving from one place to another is enriching the experience of the writer to write about the place, space, and culture. I'm curious on how you balance writing your own culture as authentic outside the Philippine environment.
Yeah, very important question. Especially for those of you who are diasporic or moving around, right? And we carry our heritage with us, and I think that's always a source of our writing. We carry our memories, we carry the places that we consider home, and that's where we write from. But we also kind of like encounter the world, right, as Filipinos. And in many ways, sometimes that doesn't get written about. Like Filipinos are everywhere. And I think the ways in which we relate to people, our experiences of traveling, sometimes don't get documented. Right. When you visit a bookstore here in the States and you look at the travel section, there's nothing written by Pinoys, even if like Pinoys are moving all across the world, right? So I think this notion of authenticity. So while authenticity is also tied to like, where we're from, and what we call home, I think authenticity is also about like how we genuinely encounter the world. Um, so for me, like Filipino-ness is not just about kung saan ka galing, right? Or where you're from. I think it's also like where you move towards. The Filipino is something you create, right? It's not an old thing. Filipino-ness is something we all create. And it's new and we transform it. And that's why we write, right? Like we don't write because it was written already. We are what we are yet to be, right? So like the Filipino is in the future tense. And I think I've always wanted to emphasize that as much as we remember history, we create new forms of being Filipino. At mahalaga yon.
And
Salamat po.
Sir Pao, maraming salamat. Sir Larry, that was really very moving. And so, could you kindly address the issue? The new curriculum now they want to remove the humanities. I'm really really worried. But what does one do to counteract the? I mean, one, if it does happen, and the other is how to even prevent it. Can we even prevent it? Go ahead, Sir Pa.
Okay po. So that's a very difficult question to answer. And I'd like to think that Rizal would have thought of it in a systemic way, which is
Mhm.
parang to see parang if we're going to really look at what's happening in the Philippines right now in education, I think there's a real movement towards widening the our view of what good education entails. So like in an EDCOM, one of the EDCOM recommendations was to improve the nutrition of mothers who when they are about to give birth. So parang expectant mothers. Parang isipin natin yun, no? Umabot na sila sa puntong yun. They've reached that point when they're seeing even prenatal nutrition and early childhood nutrition. So it's not as simple as may subjects ba na ito? Are these subjects going to be retained or removed?
Mhm.
Are these going to be transferred to senior high school? So that is part of it. But I think there's a move towards a shift, maybe, towards a more systemic view. And I think it's good. It's good to have this systemic view, but it's also good for us to give our opinions. So as I said, some of the people in the panel are friends of mine. So I can't really think of them as evil people or arbitrary people because I know how smart they are and how much they love the country. So I think they're doing their best. And because they're doing their best, let's do our best to give our opinions. But after that, there has to be a way to decide um, for the people who are seeing all these problems which no one person can see, uh, to decide for the country. And hopefully, we'll see the results 10, 12 years from now.
Maraming salamat. I'm thinking it's not how many credits we are teaching, but how we are teaching whatever is left. So every little thing counts. So if Rizal is the only class that is left, then we have to make it the best class and include critical thought in there. If it's bio, then talk about biodiversity and really care about what we do in each and every class session, because I think the root of it is like if we teach literature, we teach it only as a springboard to teach language, which is a sad, sad thing because we need the humanities to feel human and to actually embrace the world. And as Larry says, what do we see? How do we make our students see? And if we teach only what is stale, I'm sure when you quote Rizal, there's only one quote, right? Yung ang hindi magmahal sa sariling wika ay, but this Rizal has so many beautiful, beautiful passages. We do not give him enough justice. And speaking of history, for Rizal, we really, if we listened to Rizal, we wouldn't be in this mess that we are in. He has so many brilliant ideas about how we should run our country, how we should teach our children.
Oh, we lost Tita Pia.
Yeah, so I guess I'll have to continue that. So, but I think Rizal was misunderstood even during his time. So I don't think even his fellow
But
heroes
his
understood.
time
Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you. Maybe we should go to the final words from each.
Tita, you cut off, but I think you were saying let's go for the final words from our panelists. Is that correct?
Yes, please.
All right. So let's set it off then. Maybe you could start with it, Angela.
Okay, final words. Hmm. I don't really know what to say, to be honest, but maybe I'm gonna refer to a question that was also in the chat, and maybe this could be a final word because it's also centered on the participants. But I did get a question about um, asking how my poetry study sessions help forward Filipino narratives and use the Filipino languages and regional languages as a medium. And I think that's a really great question, a really challenging one. I think my ending statement in terms of answering this question is um, I think being a Filipino American in the diaspora and being part of the academic institution, I feel there isn't enough like value in just like your own presence being there. Like my presence as a professor in an academic, place, institution in the US. I think that just in that presence, there is a forwarding of that Filipino culture first and foremost and as well that can also be obviously analyzed in more pedagogical language, but I also just want to kind of just center that as a place of maybe embodiment and empowerment in forwarding Filipino culture and seeing other Filipino different types of Filipinos in academia, and than just relegating to how one academic or professor should look like and what they should be teaching. In terms of Filipino languages and regional languages, because I'm not, a fluent in though in heritage language, I like to think of language in another way, which is the poetic language, and how I, as a writer and an artist, what are the languages that I hold dear, and what do I keep, developing and maybe even innovating and and who are my influences, right? And I would say definitely a diverse group, but like Filipino writers, um, intergenerationally are folks that I'm always trying to like put a pulse in, but also knowing that I don't expect to know them all, and it just gives me more room to excavate and to search. And I think there's nothing wrong, right? I think with being an artist or an educator, um, also tuning into what your strengths are, right? And not having to live up to a particular expectation of, let's say, the academy that you should be like this. Like, what are your strengths? What can you bring, as a educator artist to the classroom, and really kind of honor that. So, but anyways, think that's what I'll end with. So thanks, Marvin, for that question.
Thank you, Angela. And if we could go to Sir Larry.
Yeah. Also, by way of answering, there's a question in the chat, a beautiful question actually from Adrian Pete Pregoner. And I'll respond to that separately. But he brings up this notion of an aesthetics of the in-between. I think I just want to emphasize like what it means to teach creative writing in your classrooms. Even if you're technically not teaching creative writing, I think creating the space for students to try out poetry or fiction or creative nonfiction, I think is a way for them to not just read the texts, but to discover their own voices. So I want to echo like what Paolo has been bringing up about really just engaging with the old texts, the canon, or like other countries' texts, like the haiku. And in that way, they discover what has been said. But I think more importantly, they discover their own voice when they're responding to the texts. And that's why I've always believed in writing creatively, and to enjoy with them. I hope you enjoy your students' writing. because sometimes they can be really, really horrible, and some more often than not, they're really, really beautiful. And while we're, like Filipino identity is not a static thing, we are continually discovering and inventing it every day. So I hope you discover new kinds of Filipino-ness in each of your classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Larry. And then our last one, Sir Pao.
Okay, so because of the discussion, I remembered a quote from Tolkien, the one who wrote The Lord of the Rings. So at that time, there were wars happening and stuff, and people were asking him, "So what are the allegories? How is your story allegorical?" And then his response was, "So what? How is it a symbol of the things that are happening now, right?" So his response was, "Allegory. Please don't accuse me of writing such a low form of literature." So, the challenge I think that I want to give is to appreciate literature for what it is. Appreciate stories as stories. Appreciate poetry as poetry. And maybe hold off on the application first, because sometimes when you do it too early, you tend to cut short the process of actually understanding the depth of what the author wants to say. So, and maybe in the end, the greatest agency is student agency, empowered by teacher agency. So it's our own skills, it's our own love for what we're teaching and for the Filipino literature, language, and culture that actually rub off onto our students. So you know that. So yeah, let's practice it. Let's read the Noli. Let's write these haikus, and let's write these all these let's do all these poetry exercises, and then we teach our students ourselves.
Maraming salamat again, Sir Pao. And to all our speakers, we really do appreciate your time and sharing your expertise today, starting from Kuya Louward. We also had Ma'am Flori and Kuya Raju. And for a second set of speakers talking about poetry and literature, from Angela to Sir Larry and Sir Pao. Maraming salamat for your time and for sharing your expertise. Again, as a tradition, we do this in the Filipino department. If our participants could join us, let's give them isang bagsak. One more, isang bagsak. Isa pa, isang bagsak. All right. Yeah.
In closing, I would like to thank my adopted anak, Markee Micu, for doing such a splendid job of hosting this webinar and was conceptualizing this project. I knew he was the only one who could do this right. Thank you to all our partners, Dr. Jason Parba, who heads the Filipino program, and special shout out to Wilmar Cabahog, our liaison for Mindanao State University. Thank you to all our speakers. We hope you leave this webinar inspired with renewed energy to face your students. Maraming salamat po. We hope to see you next week. We are doing Mindanao cultures next week. And before you go, we should do, of course, the Filipino thing of taking a photo.